Hi, I'm Walter Sennett Armstrong from Duke University.
And I'm Ram Netta from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill.
3 years ago, Ram and I constructed a Coursera course called Think Again. It taught students how to analyze and evaluate arguments.
It taught them how to tell the difference between good reasoning and bad reasoning.
Over the last 3 years, we've had a wonderful time teaching Think Again, and we've really enjoyed interacting in the discussion forums with students from all over the world.
We were extremely pleased with the reaction to our course. Over the past 3 years, over 750,000 students enrolled in that course.
But we realized that we could teach the course even more effectively if we made a few small changes.
First, it wasn't easy to cover all the material that we wanted to cover in the 12 weeks of our course. Each week contained hours of lecture, exercises, and quizzes. And doing all those hours of work every week for 12 weeks was a tall order.
In the third week of each section of that old course, we asked you to learn new material and then also take a quiz. Well, that's just too much.
So for these reasons, we decided that the best way for students to learn all of the material that we wanted to teach them was to divide up our original course into 4 much shorter courses.
That way, you can take one of the courses, take off a month or 2, take another course, maybe skip a course, we hope you won't, but do it at your own pace in the way that fits your lifestyle best.
And that way, you're most likely to end up learning all of the material that we want you to learn. Maybe not this year, but eventually.
And the material really does fit together. So even though we've split up the course into 4 separate courses, it's very worthwhile for you to take all the different courses if you possibly can.
The lectures in the mini course that you're about to take now were all part of our original 12-week course. And so frequently, you're going to find that we make references in those lectures to other features of that original 12-week course.
For example, very early on, I say that arguments have a form or a structure, and that we'll study that form or structure in future weeks in the course. Well, now that's in the second course, the course on deductive logic.
And I begin the course in deductive logic by saying, "Welcome to Unit 2 of our course." Well, I was referring to Unit 2 of our original 12-week course. But now, deductive logic is its own course. And when I talk about weeks 4 and 5, I'm referring to weeks 4 and 5 of our original 12-week course. But now, they're weeks 1 and 2 of the deductive logic course.
We hope this is not too confusing, but the basic message is really simple. Just ignore all of those cross-references to other parts of courses or other courses, just the same way that you ignore the wrinkles on an old road map.
Hey, I like to use wrinkled road maps.
Well, it's fine to use wrinkled road maps as long as you know the wrinkles aren't extra roads, because then you're going to drive off onto them.
So you're saying that the students can learn all the material that we want to teach them, even if they ignore all of our references to the old 12-week course?
Exactly.
Sounds like a plan to me.
We hope that you enjoy taking this mini course just as much as we enjoyed making it.
And we hope that it encourages you to take the other courses in our Think Again sequence.
And also to encourage your friends and family to take this series of courses as well, because it's a lot more fun to take these courses together with other people so that you can talk to them about the arguments you'll be studying.
Thank you for listening. Hello, and welcome to Unit 4 of our course. In the last 2 units, we've been focused on rules for good arguments. Specifically in Unit 2, we were focused on rules by means of which to evaluate and explain the validity of deductive arguments. And in Unit 3, we were focused on rules by means of which to evaluate and explain the strength of inductive arguments. Now, in Unit 4, we're not going to focus on good arguments, we're going to focus on bad arguments. Specifically, we're going to focus on a kind of bad argument that's called a fallacy. So what's a fallacy? Well, a fallacy is a kind of bad argument, as I said, but not all bad arguments are fallacies. Some arguments are bad because their premises are false. But that's not why fallacies are bad. Of course, a fallacy could have false premises also, but that's not what makes an argument a fallacy. What makes an argument a fallacy is that its premises, whether they're true or false, don't support its conclusion. They're not the right kind of premises to support the conclusion that the argument draws, whether they're true or false. So that's what makes a fallacy. Let me give you some examples, show you what I have in mind. So consider this argument. The majority of violent crime in the United States is committed by men who earn less than $30,000 a year. By the way, that's true. Conclusion that the argument draws from that: therefore, when you see a man who earns less than $30,000 a year, he is likely to be a violent criminal. Okay. Now, that's a bad argument. But it's not a bad argument because its premise is false. Actually, its premise is true. So what makes it a bad argument? What makes it a bad argument is that its premise doesn't support its conclusion. Right? The premise says that most of the things that fall into one category, the category of perpetrators of violent crime in the United States, also fall into a second category, the category of men who earn less than $30,000 a year. But then the conclusion says that most of the things that fall into that second category, the category of men who earn less than $30,000 a year, also fall into that first category, the category of perpetrators of violent crime. And that conclusion isn't supported by the premise. Just because the majority of things in one category also fall into a second category, it doesn't mean that the majority of things in that second category also fall into that first category. So that argument is a fallacy. And it's a fallacy, it's a bad argument, even though its premise is true. So that's one example of a fallacy. Here's another example of a fallacy. Consider this argument. Premise 1. If the national government increases spending, investors will lose confidence in the national currency. Premise 2. Investors have lost confidence in the national currency. Conclusion: the national government must have increased spending. Okay. Now, since the premises don't specify which nation we're talking about, we could imagine that there's some nation of which both of the premises are true. Right? We don't need to get into the details of which nation that would be, but imagine that there's some nation of which both of the premises are true. But even if both of the premises are true concerning that nation, they don't support the conclusion. So this argument is a fallacy. It's a bad argument, not because the premises are false, but because even if the premises are true, they still don't support the conclusion. Right? The premises say if one thing is true, let's say if national government increases spending, then a second thing is also going to be true. Investors will lose confidence. Then the second premise says that that second thing is true, that investors have lost confidence, but the conclusion says, so the first thing must be true. But that doesn't follow. Right? Remember how conditionals work. Just because a conditional is true and its consequent is true, it doesn't follow from that that the antecedent of the conditional is true. You can see that from looking at the truth table for the conditional. So this is an example of an argument in which the premises don't support the conclusion, even if the premises are true. So this argument is also a fallacy. Now, here's an example of a bad argument that's not a fallacy. Look at this one. Most of the crude oil in the world is in Texas. That's premise 1. Premise 2, Texas is going to secede from the United States. So, conclusion, domestic oil availability in the United States is going to plummet. Okay, now this argument, although it's a bad argument, is not a fallacy. It's not a fallacy because the premises really do support the conclusion. If both of those premises are true, then the conclusion has got to be true, right? If most of the crude oil in the world is in Texas and Texas is going to secede from the United States, then domestic oil availability in the United States really is going to plummet. Thankfully for domestic oil availability in the United States, though, those two premises are not true. In fact, neither of them is true. So, in any case, I'm quite confident that neither of them is true. So this is a bad argument, not because the premises don't support the conclusion. They do support the conclusion. This is a bad argument because the premises aren't true. Okay, so I've given you examples of bad arguments that are fallacies and a bad argument that's not a fallacy. But for a complete list of fallacies, anyhow, a nearly complete list of fallacies, I recommend the URL. This URL is the entry on Wikipedia for a list of fallacies, and it's a very long and nearly complete list of fallacies. So you can look at that list, think about the different kinds of fallacies there are, and we're going to describe them in more detail in this unit of the course. In this week in particular, in week 9 of the course, we're going to focus on fallacies that result from the misuse of expressions that are vague or ambiguous. Okay, see you next time. Although we're going to be focusing on fallacies in Unit 4, today I want to start off by talking about something that might or might not be a fallacy. But in any case, it exposes a linguistic phenomenon that's called vagueness and that does create fallacies. Okay, so what is the thing I'm going to talk about today? Well, it's a phenomenon I call the argument from the heap, or sometimes called the Sorites argument, after the Greek word soros, which means heap. What's the argument from the heap? Well, let me give you an example. Consider the following argument. This is an example of the argument from the heap. Premise 1, a person who owns only 1 penny is poor. Premise 2, a person who owns only 1 penny more than a poor person is also poor. Conclusion, therefore, a person who owns a gazillion pennies is poor. Now, why should we believe that those premises support that conclusion? Well, think of it this way. If premise 1 is true, then a person who owns only 1 penny is poor. But if premise 2 is true, then it's going to follow that a person who owns 2 pennies is also poor, right? Because they own only 1 penny more than a poor person. And anyway, that's obviously right. A person who owns only 2 pennies is clearly poor. And then it's going to follow by premise 2 that a person who owns 3 pennies is also poor, right? Because they only own just 1 penny more than a poor person. So they're also going to be poor. And by premise 2, it's also going to follow that a person who owns 4 pennies is poor. Now, I hope you can see the pattern here. You can see where this is going. We can keep on applying premise 2 to our results, and we'll get that a person who owns 4 pennies is poor, a person who owns 5 pennies is poor, a person who owns 6 pennies is poor, and we can go on and on and on to 1,000,000 pennies, 1,000,000,000 pennies, 1,000,000,000,000 pennies, 1,000,000,000,000 pennies, and even a gazillion pennies. Now, there's a name for that kind of reasoning, which is common in mathematics. It's called the principle of mathematical induction. The principle of mathematical induction says that arguments of the following form are valid. Where premise 1 says the number 0 belongs to some category F, in our example, the category of numbers such that anyone who owns that number of pennies is poor. If X belongs to F, then X plus 1 belongs to F, that's premise 2. So in other words, that's saying that if a particular number of pennies is such that anyone who owns just that number of pennies is poor, then adding 1 to that particular number of pennies will also leave the person poor. And the conclusion is of the form all natural numbers belong to F. In other words, no matter how many pennies you own, you're still going to be poor. Right? All natural numbers belong to the category of numbers such that a person who owns that number of pennies is poor. That's the principle of mathematical induction, stated quite generally. Now, that principle, I'm quite confident, is correct. Right? Arguments of that form are valid. If arguments of that form weren't valid, then a whole lot of mathematics that mathematicians accept today would be false. And I don't believe it is. So, the principle of mathematical induction, I'm prepared to say, is correct. But then, what's going on in this argument? Right? If the principle of induction is correct, then it looks like the argument is valid. So if the argument is valid, that means there's no possible way for the premises to be true while the conclusion is false. So, is premise 1 true? Is it true that a person who owns only 1 penny is poor? Seems quite obviously yes. Premise 1 is true. A person who owns only 1 penny has got to be poor. And there's nowhere in the world where 1 penny makes you rich. What about premise 2? If you own just 1 penny more than a poor person, could you avoid being poor by owning just 1 penny more than a poor person? I don't see how you can. 1 penny can't make the difference between being poor and not being poor. So it looks like premise 2 is true. But if the argument is valid and both of the premises are true, then that means the argument is sound. And remember, in a sound argument, the conclusion has to be true. So let's consider the conclusion. A person who owns a gazillion pennies is poor. Is that true? Well, no, it's not true. I wish I owned a gazillion pennies. Owning a gazillion pennies does not leave you poor. Someone who owns a gazillion pennies is very, very wealthy. So the conclusion seems to be obviously false. So what's going on here? Well, in logic, this is what we call a paradox. A paradox is an argument in which all of the premises of the argument seem to be obviously true, as in our argument from the heap. The argument seems to be obviously valid, again, as in our argument from the heap, but the conclusion seems to be obviously false, again, as in our argument from the heap. So our argument from the heap is one example of a paradox. There are many other examples. Now, some paradoxes are fallacies because despite appearances, even though they appear to be valid, they're really not. Really, they're arguments in which the premises don't support the conclusion, despite appearances. So some paradoxes are fallacies. But the question is this particular paradox a fallacy? Is the argument from the heap a fallacy? Or is it just a paradox? And if it is a paradox, what's the solution? Should we say that a person could avoid being poor even though they own only 1 penny? Should we say that you could avoid being poor by owning just 1 penny more than a poor person? Or should we deny the principle of mathematical induction? Or should we say that even if you own a gazillion pennies, you're still poor? How should we solve this paradox? I'll leave that for you to think about. In the last class, we talked about the argument from the heap, otherwise known as the Sorites argument. Today, I want to describe the linguistic phenomenon that gives rise to that argument, gives rise to the paradox, explain what that linguistic phenomenon is and why it gives rise to the paradox. The phenomenon is what's known as vagueness. So, what's vagueness? Well, here's a definition along with some examples. So, an expression is vague when there's no precise boundary between the cases to which that expression correctly applies and the cases to which it does not correctly apply. So here's some examples. Poor, as we just saw in the last lecture, bald, tall, accomplished, famous. Here, consider. What is the precise boundary line between baldness and non-baldness? Is there some precise line where if you have fewer hairs on your head than that, then you're bald, but if you have more hairs on your head than that, then you're not bald. No, there's no precise line. Baldness is vague. You can be more bald by having fewer hairs on your head. You can be less bald by having more hairs on your head. But baldness is vague. There's no precise line between baldness and non-baldness. How about tall? Is there some precise line where if you're taller than that, then you're tall, but if you're shorter than that, then you're not tall? No. Again, there's no precise line. Some people are taller than others, but there's no precise line where if you exceed that height, then you're tall. How about being accomplished? Is there some precise amount of accomplishment that you have to achieve in order to count as an accomplished person? No. Accomplished, again, is a vague expression. There's no precise amount of accomplishment that's required in order for you to be an accomplished person. Clearly, some people are accomplished, but it's not clear exactly what the outlines of that category are. Some people are clearly included in that category. Some people are clearly not included in that category. But where exactly does the boundary line fall? That's not clear. It's vague. And again, famous. How many people have to know who you are in order for you to be famous? Is Walter famous? Well, someone might say, sure, Walter's famous. Tens of thousands of students are taking his course. Yeah, but someone might say, no, Walter's not famous. Tom Cruise is famous. So, how many people have to know who you are in order for you to be famous? It's not clear. It's vague. So those are some examples of vagueness, examples of expressions that fit the definition of vagueness. Now, why do these expressions give rise to paradox, give rise to the Sorites paradox, the argument from the heap? Here's why. If there's no precise boundaries between cases to which an expression correctly applies and cases to which it incorrectly applies, cases to which it does not correctly apply, then it's going to seem obviously true that making a minuscule change, just having a minuscule difference from a case to which an expression correctly applies or correctly doesn't apply, isn't going to make the difference between whether or not the expression correctly applies. Right? Having someone be just ever so slightly taller than a short person isn't going to make that person tall. If they're ever so slightly taller than a short person, they're still going to be short. If they're ever so slightly less famous than a famous person, they're still going to be famous. Right? It's going to seem that way as long as the boundary line between cases of correct application and cases of incorrect application is not clear. But the problem is that a series of minuscule differences or minuscule changes can add up to a big change. So there could be a big change between two people, but if you just look at the minuscule changes, it'll look like, well, if one person isn't famous, then the other one must not be famous. If one person isn't rich, then the other person must not be rich. Again, because the minuscule differences are so minuscule that they seem not to involve crossing any threshold from cases of correct application to cases of incorrect application. Right? The differences are too small to allow for you to cross that threshold. Well, the reason is that the threshold isn't a precise one. So that's why it seems like when you have minuscule differences, they're not going to allow you to cross that threshold. If the threshold is fuzzy, then a minuscule difference isn't going to be enough to cross it. But you add up a whole bunch of minuscule differences and you get a big difference, a difference that is big enough to cross the threshold. So that's why vagueness leads to paradox. And here are some examples. Suppose someone says, well, a person with no hair is bald. I mean, clearly someone with no hair at all is bald. But someone with one more hair than a bald person is still bald, right? It seems like if the only difference between you and me is that you have one more hair than I do, then if I'm bald, you must also be bald, right? Someone who has only one more hair than a bald person is bald. But from those two premises, it follows by the principle of mathematical induction that someone with a billion hairs on their head is bald. I mean, I don't even know if it's possible to have a billion hairs on a human head, but if it is, presumably someone who did have a billion hairs on their head would not be bald. And yet, that conclusion follows validly from our two premises. Consider this other example. Someone who's only a meter in height is short. Right? A meter, for those of you who live in the United States, is about 39 inches. So someone who's only a meter in height is a short person. Now you might think, well, someone who's only 1 millimeter taller than a short person is also short. If two people differ in height by 1,000th of a meter, then if one of them is short, you think the other one's got to be short too. But from those two premises, again, it follows by the principle of mathematical induction that someone who's 5 meters tall is short. And that, I can assure you, is not true. Someone who's 5 meters tall, again, for the benefit of people living in the United States, someone who's 5 meters tall is about 195 inches tall. So that would be very, very tall. That would be taller than Dwight Howard. Okay, so again, why does this paradox arise? It arises because vagueness makes the second premise appear to be true. Vagueness makes it seem as if a minuscule difference between two things can't cross the threshold from correct application of an expression to incorrect application of an expression. So that's why the paradox arises. Okay, next time we'll see how the phenomenon of vagueness, how vague expressions can generate not just paradoxes, but also fallacies. See you next time. In the last lecture, we discussed the phenomenon of vagueness and saw why that phenomenon can lead to paradox. In this lecture, and the ones to follow, I want to show how the phenomenon of vagueness can lead not just to paradox, but also to fallacies. Today, we're going to talk about a particular kind of fallacy called a conceptual slippery slope fallacy that results from the phenomenon of vagueness. So what's a conceptual slippery slope fallacy? Well, let me give you a definition. A conceptual slippery slope fallacy is an argument that exploits the vagueness of the category that's involved in the argument in order to argue that there's no significant difference between things that belong to that category and things that don't belong to that category. Okay, so let me give you some examples of this definition. So here's one example. Consider this argument. Premise 1. A person who is 1 meter in height is short. Premise 2. A difference of 1 millimeter is not a significant difference. Certainly not a significant difference in human height. Maybe it's a significant difference in some things, but not in human height. Premise 3, a person who is 2 meters in height is tall. Conclusion, there's no significant difference between being short and being tall. Okay, now notice this is different than the argument from the heap. The argument from the heap would have gone from the premise that a person who's 1 meter in height is short to the conclusion that a person who is 2 meters in height or 5 meters in height or any height at all is also going to be short. That's not what this argument is saying. This argument allows that there's a difference between being short and being tall, but the difference just isn't significant because the difference is made up of a series of differences, each one of which is not significant. Right? The difference between being 1 meter in height and being 2 meters in height is made up of a series of 1 millimeter differences, and 1 millimeter differences are not significant differences in human height. So the argument concludes the 1 meter difference in human height between a 1 meter person and a 2 meter person, that 1 meter difference in human height is itself not a significant difference. So there is no significant difference, the argument concludes, between being short and being tall. Okay, now that's a fallacy. And it's a fallacy Not because its premises are false. Actually, its premises are, I think, not false. I think its premises are true. It's a fallacy because the premises don't support the conclusion. Remember, that's what makes it a fallacy, is that the premises don't support the conclusion, even if they are true. Why don't the premises support the conclusion? Well, here's why. The conclusion says that a height difference of 1 meter is not significant. And the premises say that a height difference of 1 millimeter is not significant. And of course, a height difference of 1 meter is made up of a series of 1,000 height differences of 1 millimeter. But just because a millimeter height difference is not significant, and a meter height difference is made up of 1,000 1 millimeter height differences, it doesn't follow that a 1 meter height difference is not significant. Differences that are significant can be made up out of a bunch of differences that are individually insignificant. So that's why this argument right here is a fallacy. Consider another example to illustrate the same point. A person who owns only 1 penny is poor. A difference of 1 penny is not a significant difference in human wealth, right? You don't become significantly wealthier or less wealthy by gaining or losing a penny. And a person who owns a gazillion pennies is not poor, they're rich. Well, from those 3 premises, this argument concludes, there's no significant difference between being poor and being rich. Okay, once again, the argument starts off with 3 premises, each of which is quite plausibly true. I think it is true. But then it draws a conclusion that's ridiculous. Well, why? Well, it's because the argument is one in which the premises don't really support the conclusion. So even if the premises are true, they don't support the conclusion. They don't give us good reason to believe that the conclusion is true. And that's because even if the difference between being poor and being rich is made up out of a series of 1 penny differences, and even if a 1 penny difference is insignificant, it doesn't follow that the difference between being poor and being rich is insignificant, right? A difference that's made up out of a bunch of insignificant differences can still itself be significant. Just because its components are insignificant doesn't mean that it is insignificant. Compare this to the following point. Just because each person in a group is not powerful, does that mean that the group is not powerful? No. Sometimes composites, collections, can have properties, can have features, can belong to categories that their individual members don't have, don't belong to. Right? So even if each individual member of a group is not powerful, that doesn't mean the group is not powerful. And similarly, even if each 1 penny component of the difference between poverty and wealth is not a significant difference, that doesn't mean that the complete difference, the series of 1 penny differences, is not a significant difference. So that's why this is a fallacy, right? These arguments, which we'll call conceptual slippery slope arguments, are arguments in which the premises could all be true. There are many conceptual slippery slope arguments in which the premises are all true, but the premises don't support the conclusion. And what makes the argument tempting is the vagueness of the category that the argument makes use of, the category of tall, the category of poor, whatever category it is that the argument makes use of. If it's a vague category, then you can construct a conceptual slippery slope argument that uses that category. In the next lecture, we'll see how vague categories can give rise to other slippery slope arguments as well. In the last lecture, we saw how the phenomenon of vagueness gives rise to a kind of fallacy that we called a conceptual slippery slope. Today, we're going to see how that same phenomenon of vagueness gives rise to another kind of fallacy. This kind of fallacy we're going to call the fairness slippery slope. It's also a kind of slippery slope argument, but it concerns fairness. Okay, so what's a fairness slippery slope argument? Well, here's the definition. A fairness slippery slope argument is one that exploits the vagueness of a category to argue that it's unfair to treat cases that fall into that category differently from cases that don't fall into that category. So what's an example of that? And here's one example. So suppose I argue as follows. Premise 1, a person who scores 100% on the exam passes. Right? If any score passes, 100% must pass. So let's suppose a person who scores 100% on the exam passes. Well, a difference of 0.01% is not a significant difference. Therefore, the argument concludes, it's not fair to fail someone who scores a 10% on the exam. In fact, it's not fair to fail someone who scores a 0% on the exam. Now, how does that thinking go? Well, it goes like this. If a person who scores 100% passes, and there's no significant difference between a person who scores 100% and a person who scores 99.99%, then it's not fair to fail someone who scores 99.99%. But then for the same reason, it's also not going to be fair to fail someone who scores 99.98%. And then, for the same reason, it's not going to be fair to fail someone who scores 99.97%, and so on, all the way down the scale. Right? It can't be fair to fail them because there's no significant difference between that score and a score that's 0.01% higher. So that's a fairness slippery slope argument. Now, why is this a fallacy? Well, it's a fallacy because it assumes that it can't be fair to fail someone whose score is not significantly different from a passing score. Right? If a score of 70% is passing, then by premise 2, a score of 69.99% is not significantly different from that. But it doesn't follow, just because 69.99% is not significantly different from 70%, it doesn't follow that it's not fair to fail someone who got a 69.99%. It could perfectly well be fair to fail them, for all the two premises say. Right? Fairness doesn't necessarily go with significant differences. It could go, let's say, with predictable differences. Right? If I tell you in advance that the minimum score for passing the test is 70%, then even though there's not a significant difference between 69.99% and 70%, still, you knew in advance that 70% was the minimum score for passing the test. So if you get a 69.99%, it might be fair to fail you, even though that score is not significantly different from 70%. Okay, so that's why fairness slippery slope arguments are fallacies. They're fallacies because they assume something that might not be true, which is that it can't be fair to fail someone who has a score that's not significantly different from a passing score. So that's why these are fallacies. Let's look at another example. So premise 1, a 9-month-old human fetus, let's say a human fetus that's almost to its due date, or maybe on its due date, has a right to live. I think we might all agree with that. Premise 2, a difference of 1 minute of prenatal development is not a significant difference. We might all agree with that too. Conclusion of this fairness slippery slope argument, it's not fair to deny a fertilized egg the right to live. Okay, but once again, that doesn't follow from the premises, right? I'm not saying it's not true. The conclusion of that argument might, for all I'm going to say today, might very well be true. My point is not whether it's true or false. My point is that the conclusion is not supported by the premises. And the reason it's not supported by the premises is because this argument assumes, again, that it can't be fair to deny a prenatal life the right to live if it's not significantly different from a prenatal life that does have the right to live. Again, it assumes that differences in fair treatment have to be significant differences. And again, that might very well not be true. So that's why this is a fairness slippery slope argument. That's why this is a fallacy. Okay, now let me say in general, When someone gives a fairness slippery slope argument in ordinary life, they usually don't lay it out in the way that I'm laying out these arguments. Usually what they do is say something like, well, where do you draw the line? Where that question is not understood so much as a sincere question as rather a pointed question. It's a question they're asking of which is simply an attempt to make a point. They're simply trying to make a point that there's no reasonable way to draw a line that needs to be drawn. So in asking that question, someone is in effect assuming that because little differences are not significant, it can't be fair to treat those slightly different cases, those insignificantly different cases, differently. So when you hear someone ask, where do you draw the line, often you should beware, because a fairness slippery slope fallacy might be lurking in the midst. Okay, see you next time. In the last two lectures, we saw how the phenomenon of vagueness gives rise to a couple different kinds of fallacy, the conceptual slippery slope fallacy and the fairness slippery slope fallacy. Today, I'd like to describe another kind of fallacy that arises because of the phenomenon of vagueness. We're going to call this the causal slippery slope fallacy. So, what's a causal slippery slope fallacy? Well, here's the definition. A causal slippery slope fallacy, or causal slippery slope argument, right, because all fallacies are arguments. A causal slippery slope argument is one that exploits the vagueness of a category to argue that a particular event that you're considering, maybe a course of action that you're considering performing, or maybe just an event that you're imagining. A particular event will lead to a calamity that's causally connected to that event by a series of steps. So sometimes this is called a domino argument. Sometimes it's called a parade of horrors. The idea is there's a series of steps that eventually leads to some calamity. And so we should cut off that series of steps before it begins. We should prevent it from ever beginning, because if we allow it to begin, then it'll eventually lead to some calamity. That's the form that a causal slippery slope argument takes. So what are some examples of causal slippery slope arguments, and why are they fallacies? Well, here's some examples. So consider this. Premise one, if we let doctors euthanize patients under any circumstances whatsoever, it's likely, not certain, but likely, that we'll eventually let doctors kill patients who are depressed or in severe pain, independently of whether or not their condition is terminal or hopeless. Premise two, if we let doctors kill patients who are depressed or in severe pain, then it's very likely that we'll eventually let doctors kill patients who are a nuisance. Premise three, doctors should not be allowed to kill patients who are a nuisance, right? Simply being a nuisance shouldn't license a doctor to kill you. In conclusion, doctors should not be allowed to euthanize patients. Okay, so there's a causal slippery slope argument. What it tells us is that if we allow euthanasia, then that's going to have a certain likely consequence, which in turn would itself have a certain consequence which would be unacceptable. So we shouldn't allow euthanasia because of the indirect consequences of allowing euthanasia. Now, why is that not a good argument? Why is that a fallacy? Here's why it's a fallacy. Just because one event is likely to have a certain result, and that result is likely itself to have a certain result, it doesn't follow that the first event is likely to have that last result. Right? Consider this example. Suppose that dating leads to marriage with a 66% probability. Right? 66%, I'm just making this up obviously, but let's suppose that 66% of couples who date end up getting married. Now, let's suppose that 66% of married couples get divorced. And let's suppose that 66% of divorced couples end up not being on speaking terms with each other. Okay, So it's likely that if you're dating, you'll get married. It's likely that if you get married, you'll get divorced. And it's likely that if you get divorced, then you won't be on speaking terms with each other. Let's suppose. Does it follow from that that it's likely that if you're dating, then eventually you won't be on speaking terms with each other? From the premises I just gave, it doesn't follow from the fact that you're dating right now that you'll eventually end up not being on speaking terms with each other. It doesn't even follow that it's likely that you'll end up not being on speaking terms with each other. Right? Just because each event in the chain is likely given the one before it, it doesn't mean that the last event in the chain is likely given the first event in the chain, because the probability could reduce at each point in the chain. And if the probability reduces just a couple times, it could go from something could go from being likely to being unlikely. Here's another example of a causal slippery slope argument. Okay, let's suppose I say, premise one, if we allow the distribution of birth control in colleges, then it's likely that we will allow it in high schools, eventually. Premise two, if we allow the distribution of birth control in high schools, then it's likely that eventually we'll allow it in elementary schools. Premise three, we should not allow the distribution of birth control in elementary schools. Conclusion, we should not allow the distribution of birth control in colleges. Now again, why is that a fallacy? Why don't the premises support the conclusion? Just because each step in that series is likely given the preceding step, it doesn't follow that the last step in the series is likely given the first step in the series. In other words, just because it's likely that we'll allow distribution of birth control in high schools given that we allow it in colleges, and it's likely that we'll allow it in elementary schools given that we allow it in high schools, it doesn't follow from that that it's likely that we'll allow it in elementary schools given that we allow it in colleges. Likelihood is not transitive in that way. That's why causal slippery slope arguments are fallacies. That doesn't mean that their conclusions are never true. Their conclusions could well be true, but again, what we're talking about here is whether or not a causal slippery slope argument gives good support for its conclusion. And the point I'm making today is that it doesn't. A causal slippery slope argument, while it might be arguing for a true conclusion, doesn't give a good reason for accepting that conclusion. Okay, so that wraps up the topic of vagueness and the fallacies to which vagueness gives rise. In the next lecture, we'll talk about a different phenomenon, something that we call ambiguity, and we'll consider the fallacies to which ambiguity gives rise. See you next time. Today, we're going to talk about the phenomenon of ambiguity and how that phenomenon, like the phenomenon of vagueness, can give rise to fallacies. Okay, so first, what's ambiguity? Well, here's a definition, along with some examples. Ambiguity is when an expression has more than one acceptable interpretation, more than one correct interpretation. So, some examples of this. There are cases where a single word has more than one correct interpretation. So consider the word bank. In English, a bank could be a financial institution, an institution in which you can deposit money, invest money, on which you can write checks and so forth. Or a bank could be the edge of a river bank. Consider the word cardinal. Cardinals are members of the papal hierarchy. They're below the pope, but they're higher than priests. So that's one interpretation of cardinal, but there's another interpretation of cardinal. Well, actually, there are several other interpretations of cardinal. A cardinal could be a kind of red finch, a particular kind of bird. A cardinal could also be a St. Louis baseball player, a player for the St. Louis baseball team. And there's also a use of cardinal as an adjective, not as a noun. These are examples of single words that have more than one acceptable interpretation in English. But sometimes you have a whole phrase or a sentence that has more than one acceptable interpretation. So for instance, consider the sentence, "She is an Asian historian." Well, there are two perfectly good interpretations of that sentence, depending on the situation in which it's used. It might be saying that she is an Asian person who is a historian, or it might be saying that she's a historian of Asian history. She studies the history of Asia. Consider the sentence, police kill man with axe. Well, there are at least two different ways of understanding that sentence. It could be understood as saying that there's this man with an axe and the police killed him, or it could be understood as saying that the police killed that man and they killed him by using an axe. Again, two acceptable but very different interpretations of the same sentence. Okay. So why does this phenomenon of ambiguity, which I should stress is very widespread, not just in English, but in every spoken language, why does this phenomenon of ambiguity give rise to fallacies? Here's why. If an expression has two acceptable interpretations, and we switch between those two interpretations in the course of a single argument, we switch between them mid-argument, then we can construct an argument that might seem valid, but it isn't valid. Let me give you some examples to illustrate this possibility. So here's one example. Suppose I reason as follows. Well, Jones, I'm told, was sentenced to 9 years in the violin case. Now you might think, well, our criminal justice system is not supposed to sentence anyone to spend time inside a violin case, and therefore Jones's sentencing was a breach of justice. What's very likely to be going on in this example is that the interpretation of sentence to 9 years in the violin case is different in the first premise than it is in the second premise. In the first premise, when I say Jones, I'm told, was sentenced to 9 years in the violin case, I don't mean that Jones was sentenced to spend time inside the violin case. I mean that Jones was sentenced to spend 9 years in prison, and he was sentenced to do that in a particular criminal case that I'm referring to as the violin case. Maybe it was a case in which an expensive violin was stolen, and it was stolen through armed robbery, and Jones was found guilty of armed robbery of the violin and then sentenced to spend 9 years in prison. So that's what I probably mean when I say something like premise 1. But premise 2 interprets the phrase sentenced to 9 years in the violin case in another way. It interprets that phrase as saying Jones was sentenced to spend 9 years of his life inside a violin case. Okay, now clearly premise 1, when properly understood, could very well be true, and premise 2, when properly understood, could very well be true. But the reason the conclusion doesn't follow from those two premises, the reason this is a fallacy, is because the correct understanding of sentenced to spend 9 years in the violin case in premise 1 is different from the correct understanding of that same phrase in premise 2. So premise 1 and premise 2 together don't imply anything about Jones's sentencing being a breach of justice or being a violation of the rules of our criminal justice system. That phrase means something different in the two premises. So that's why we have a fallacy here. Superficially, the argument might look valid, but actually it's a fallacy. It's not a valid argument. Here's another example. Suppose I say, Amelia Bedelia was told to dress the chicken for dinner. Right? Those of you who are familiar with the Amelia Bedelia stories, these are children's stories about a servant who's given a set of instructions and interprets them all differently than the way they're intended. So one of her instructions was to dress the chicken for dinner. And clearly, the woman who told Amelia Bedelia to dress the chicken for dinner was understanding the word dress in a particular way, such that it's a way of preparing a chicken to be cooked for dinner. Well, Amelia Bedelia hears the instructions and then goes off looking for some dinner clothes that are just small enough to fit the chicken. And turns out she can't find dinner clothes that are small enough to fit the chicken. Right? Their family just doesn't have dinner clothes that are that small in their house. So Amelia Bedelia could not find dinner attire small enough to fit the chicken. So you might conclude from those two premises that Amelia Bedelia was not able to do as she was told. She wasn't given the resources to follow her instructions. But that's false. What happened is that Amelia Bedelia misunderstood the instructions. The instructions were intended to be understood in one way, and Amelia Bedelia understood them in a different way. And so, while this argument might superficially appear to be valid, in fact, it isn't valid at all. Again, this argument trades on an ambiguity in the phrase dress. Dress the chicken for dinner. Right? There's two possible interpretations of that phrase. The instructions that Amelia Bedelia was given had one interpretation that was correct, but Amelia Bedelia's understanding of those instructions relied on the alternative interpretation, the interpretation that was incorrect. And so it seems to Amelia Bedelia as if she couldn't carry out her instructions, but that's because she misunderstood the instructions. She gave them one interpretation when they were supposed to have the other. Okay, so these are some examples of ambiguity and how ambiguity can give rise to fallacies. In the next lecture, we'll talk about a couple different kinds of ambiguity, and we'll look at examples of each of those kinds. See you next time. Today, I want to talk about two different kinds of ambiguity, and I want to explain how each of these different kinds of ambiguity can give rise to fallacies. I call them semantic and syntactic ambiguity. So what are these two different kinds of ambiguity? Let's look at some examples. So here are examples of semantic ambiguity. Semantic ambiguity is when a particular word has two different interpretations. The two different interpretations are two different interpretations of that one word. So one example is, consider the newspaper headline, Gandhi stoned in rally in India. Well, there are two different interpretations of the verb stoned, right? One interpretation is people threw stones at Gandhi at the rally in India. Another interpretation is Gandhi was using illicit drugs at the rally in India. So those are two different interpretations of the word stoned, and they give rise to two different interpretations of what someone is saying when they say Gandhi stoned in rally in India. Consider the sentence, Iraqi head seeks arms. Okay, that sentence actually has two words that are ambiguous. There's the word head and there's the word arms. Head could be interpreted to mean a part of the body, right, the head, or it could be understood to mean part of the body politic, right, the head of the body politic, the Iraqi president, or the head of state, or the head of their defense department, or their military department, but the head of some organization. That's to say, the leader of some organization. So the word head could be interpreted to mean the leader of some organization. It could also be understood to mean the head, the top of the body. Arms. Well, arms, of course, could be understood to mean arms, right, these appendages, or they could be understood to mean weapons. So that sentence has two words, each of which is semantically ambiguous. And then there's the sentence, Meredith is in a terrible state. Well, of course you might mean, when you say Meredith is in a terrible state, you might mean she's in a terrible psychological state. She's very depressed, she's very upset, she's very angry. Or you might mean that she's in a state, like one of the United States or one of the states of some other country, but she's in a state which is a terrible state. We don't need to name those. Okay, so these are examples of sentences that contain semantic ambiguity, semantically ambiguous expressions. Let's see how some of these give rise to fallacies. So consider this argument. Premise 1, Gandhi stoned in rally in India. Premise 2, drug users are not qualified to lead. Conclusion, Gandhi not qualified to lead. Okay, now superficially that might look like a valid argument, right? Gandhi falls into a certain category, stoned in the rally in India. People who fall into that category are not qualified to lead, so Gandhi's not qualified to lead. But here's the thing. That first premise, as I said just a moment ago, has two acceptable interpretations. It could be understood as meaning people threw stones at Gandhi in the rally in India, or it could mean Gandhi was using illicit drugs at the rally in India. Now, if it means the second thing, then this argument is valid. Gandhi is not qualified to lead, at least given the truth of the two premises. And I'm not going to comment on the truth or falsehood of the second premise. But the most plausible interpretation of that first premise is not that Gandhi was using illicit drugs at the rally in India, it's that people threw stones at Gandhi at the rally in India. And so, on that interpretation, just because people threw stones at Gandhi at the rally in India, that doesn't mean Gandhi was using drugs. And so it doesn't mean that Gandhi falls into the category that the second premise is talking about. And so on that interpretation of premise 1, the argument is not valid. It's a fallacy. Okay, so there's an example of how the semantic ambiguity of the expression stoned can give rise to a fallacy, right? An argument that superficially seems valid, but it seems that way superficially only because we're assigning the wrong interpretation to the word stoned. Okay, here's another example of how semantic ambiguity can give rise to a fallacy. So consider this argument. Meredith is in a terrible state. Meredith is in Texas. And therefore, Texas is a terrible state. Okay, now apart from the question of whether or not the conclusion is true, I'd like you to notice that if the first premise is understood as it most plausibly is understood, as meaning that Meredith is in a terrible psychological state, let's say she's depressed, or she's very anxious, or she's upset, if that's the correct way to understand the first premise, then the argument is a fallacy. I mean, superficially, it might seem valid. Meredith is in a terrible state. Meredith is in Texas, so Texas must be a terrible state. Well, superficially, that might seem valid, but it seems that way only because we're relying on one interpretation of the phrase state, terrible state. The correct way to understand premise 1 is on the other interpretation, the interpretation according to which a terrible state is a terrible psychological state, not a terrible political or geographical state. So when we say Meredith is in a terrible state, we're just saying that she's in a terrible psychological state. So from the fact that Meredith is in a terrible psychological state and the fact that she's in Texas, we can't infer anything about whether or not Texas, the state of Texas, is a terrible state. Nothing follows. Okay, so those are some examples of how semantic ambiguity gives rise to fallacies. Now, I said there was another kind of ambiguity, syntactic ambiguity. So what's that, and how does it give rise to fallacies? Syntactic ambiguity is when you have a phrase that can be given two different interpretations where the two different interpretations differ in the grammar, in what grammatical categories are assigned to different parts of that phrase. So let me give you some examples to illustrate the idea. Consider the sentence, the government asks us to save soap and waste paper. Right? Clearly, there are two different interpretations of that sentence. It might be saying that the government asks us to save two things, soap and waste paper. Or it might be understood as saying that the government is asking us to do two things. First, to save soap, and secondly, to waste paper. Those are two different interpretations, and they differ not in the meaning of any particular word, they differ in how you're supposed to understand the nature of the government's request. Is the government asking us to do two things, one involving saving and one involving wasting? Or is the government asking us to do one thing involving saving, but saving two different kinds of things, soap and waste paper? So that's an example of syntactic ambiguity. Here's another example. Tuna biting off Washington coast. Again, there are two different ways to interpret this sentence. You can interpret it, perhaps most plausibly, as saying to fishermen, look, if you're interested in fishing for tuna, you should fish off the Washington coast, because if you fish off the Washington coast, you'll find that the tuna there are biting. Right? So you'll be able to catch tuna if you fish off the Washington coast. Another interpretation of that same sentence, somewhat less plausible, is to say that the tuna are biting off the Washington coast. The Washington coast is itself disappearing as the tuna bite it off. Right? And those two different interpretations differ according to whether biting is understood as a verb or biting off is understood as a verb phrase that relates tuna to the Washington coast. Okay. Finally, consider this example. Police can't stop gambling. Okay, there are two different ways of understanding this sentence. Again, two different correct interpretations, two different possible interpretations. One is a saying that there's gambling taking place and the police just can't stop it. No matter what the police do, the gambling will continue to take place because the gamblers are gambling in hidden places where the police can't find them, or the gamblers are gambling in places where the police don't have a warrant to search, but the gambling is going on and the police just can't do anything to stop it. Or the sentence could be understood as saying, the police themselves are gambling and they just can't stop. No matter how hard they try, they can't stop themselves from gambling. Okay. Two different interpretations of the sentence, police can't stop gambling. Now notice how these examples of syntactic ambiguity can give rise to fallacies. Let's consider some examples. So, consider the following argument. Police can't stop gambling. Anyone who can't stop gambling needs therapy. Therefore, the police need therapy. Now, superficially, this argument might look valid. Right? It might seem to be saying the police fall into this category of people who can't stop gambling, and anyone who falls into that category needs therapy, so the police need therapy. But that's relying on one interpretation of the sentence, the police can't stop gambling, and that's not the interpretation that's probably correct. The interpretation that's probably correct is that gambling is going on and the police can't do anything to stop it from going on. And if that's the correct interpretation of premise one, then the argument is invalid. The argument is a fallacy, right? That fact that the police can't stop gambling from going on, and that anyone who can't stop themselves from gambling needs therapy, from those two premises, that doesn't support the conclusion that the police need therapy, right? It might support the conclusion that the inveterate gamblers that the police can't stop from gambling need therapy, but it doesn't support the conclusion that the police need therapy. So that's an example of how the syntactic ambiguity in the sentence, police can't stop gambling, can give rise to a fallacy. Here's another example. Consider, premise one, the government asks us to save soap and waste paper. Premise two, it's wrong to waste recyclable resources like paper. So conclusion, the government's request is unreasonable. Okay, now superficially, again, this argument might appear to be valid because it might appear that, well, the government is asking us to do a couple of different things and it's wrong to do one of those two things, so the government's request is unreasonable. But that interpretation of premise one, according to which the government is asking us to do a couple of different things, saving soap and wasting paper, that's not the most likely interpretation of that premise. The most likely interpretation of that premise is an interpretation according to which it's saying that the government is asking us to do one thing, to save, but it's asking us to save a couple different things, soap and waste paper. And then, from the fact that the government is asking us to save waste paper, and that it's wrong to waste recyclable resources like paper, well, it doesn't follow at all that the government's request is unreasonable. And those two premises don't at all support the conclusion. And so, given the most likely interpretation of premise one, This is a fallacy. This is a bad argument. It's a bad argument, but superficially it might seem like a good argument, again, because of the syntactic ambiguity in the phrase, save soap and waste paper. Okay, so those are some examples to illustrate how semantic ambiguity and syntactic ambiguity can each give rise to fallacies. In the last couple of lectures, we've been talking about the phenomena of ambiguity, semantic ambiguity and syntactic ambiguity, and we've shown how these phenomena can give rise to fallacies. Well, the fallacies to which ambiguities give rise are what we'll call fallacies of equivocation. Today we're going to talk about fallacies of equivocation. So, what's a fallacy of equivocation? Well, here's how we define it. A fallacy of equivocation is a fallacy that results when an argument appears to be valid only because it switches between two different interpretations of an ambiguous expression. Right? So, a fallacy of equivocation, since it's a fallacy, it can't be valid, but it appears to be valid, and it appears that way only because it switches between the two different interpretations. Okay, so we've already seen a bunch of examples. Today, I just want to present a couple more examples of fallacies of equivocation. So here's one. Consider this argument. 6 is an odd number of legs for a horse. That's true. Horses typically have 4 legs. Odd numbers cannot be divided by 2. That's true also. That's just the definition of an odd number. 3, 5, 7, 9, 11. These are all odd numbers because they can't be divided by 2. Therefore, the argument concludes, 6 cannot be divided by 2. Okay. That's a fallacy. It might appear to be valid because when you look at the first premise and it says 6 is an odd number of legs for a horse, you might think, oh, well, that means 6 is an odd number, right? Because it's an odd number of legs for a horse, which means it's an odd number of legs, which means it's an odd number. And since odd numbers can't be divided by 2, you might think you can conclude that 6 cannot be divided by 2. But of course, that's wrong. That conclusion is false, and it's not supported by the premises when properly understood. When the first premise says 6 is an odd number of legs for a horse, that doesn't imply 6 is an odd number. The correct interpretation of odd number as it occurs in the first premise is different from the correct interpretation of odd number as it occurs in the second premise. The phrase odd number can have a couple different interpretations. On one interpretation, it means a number that's not divisible by 2. On the other interpretation, it means an unusual number. This argument appears to be valid only because it switches between those two interpretations from premise 1 to premise 2. 6 is an unusual number of legs for a horse, and of course, odd numbers, numbers that are not divisible by 2, of course by definition can't be divided by 2, but it doesn't follow that 6 can't be divided by 2. 6 is an odd number in the first sense of being an unusual number of legs for a horse, but it's not an odd number in the second sense. It's not an odd number in the sense of a number that's not divisible by 2. So that's an example of a fallacy of equivocation. Here's another example. Man is the only rational animal. I believe it was Aristotle who said the ancient Greek equivalent of that. No woman is a man. That seems true. Therefore, no woman is a rational animal. Okay, now, superficially, it might look like that argument is valid. But in fact, that's a fallacy. That's not a valid argument. Why? Well, because the expression man can be given two different interpretations, and this argument switches between those two different interpretations. Right? So, on one interpretation of man, it just means an adult male human. And on that interpretation, it's true that no woman is a man. Premise 2 is true when the word man is understood that way, is given that interpretation as just adult male human. But sometimes the word man is used more generally to mean human being. And when it's used that way, while premise 1 might be true, premise 2 certainly isn't true. It certainly isn't true that no woman is a human being. All women are human beings. So, while premise 1 might be true on that more general interpretation of the word man, premise 2 is not true on that more general interpretation of the word man. So the reason this argument is a fallacy is because there's no single interpretation of the word man on which premise 1 and premise 2 could possibly both be true. Right? There are two interpretations of the word man. On one of those interpretations, premise 1 might be true. On the other of those interpretations, premise 2 is true, but there's no interpretation on which both premise 1 and premise 2 could possibly be true. And by the way, I should mention, for those who use the word man to mean something very general like human being, that they would then have to feel comfortable saying things like, man nurses his young for up to 2 years, or man gestates his fetuses for 9 months. I wonder. Anyhow, so those are examples of some fallacies of equivocation. Next week, we'll be talking about very different sorts of fallacies, fallacies of relevance. See you next week. Welcome to week 10 of our course. In this week, we'll be studying fallacies of relevance and vacuity. Now, before I say what fallacies of relevance and vacuity are, let me make an important distinction between the fallacies of relevance and vacuity that we'll be studying this week and the fallacies of vagueness and ambiguity that we studied last week. The important distinction that I have in mind is this. Fallacies of vagueness and ambiguity are very hard to avoid, whereas fallacies of relevance and vacuity are quite easy to avoid once you recognize what they are. The reason that fallacies of vagueness and ambiguity are very hard to avoid is because it's very easy to make those fallacies given the pervasiveness of vagueness and ambiguity in the language that we speak. Now you might think, well, but why should there be vagueness and ambiguity in the language that we speak? I mean, why don't we just speak a language that does away with vagueness and ambiguity? In fact, there are a lot of communities that try to purge their technical language of vagueness and ambiguity. Like in scientific communities, they might try to use a language that doesn't have the same amount of vagueness and ambiguity that we have in ordinary language. But why don't we purge vagueness and ambiguity from ordinary language? Is it just a bother to purge ordinary language of vagueness and ambiguity, and that's why we don't do it? Well, no, I think there's actually a deeper reason. I think there's a reason why it's important for ordinary language to have vagueness and ambiguity in it. And as long as ordinary language does have vagueness and ambiguity in it, it's going to be very hard for us to get rid of fallacies of vagueness and ambiguity. We can do it, but we have to keep a watchful eye out for cases where we're using phrases that are ambiguous or vague in our arguments. Okay, so why is it important for ordinary language to have expressions that are vague or ambiguous? Well, let me give you some examples. Suppose we're planning a vacation, and we're planning a vacation to an island in the Caribbean. Let's say Jamaica. And we're trying to figure out when the best time would be to go. And we think, well, we don't want to go in the summertime because it'll be too hot there. We want to go in the wintertime because then we get maximum relief from the cold that we experience where we live right now. So let's say we decide, okay, we want to go to Jamaica in the wintertime. Okay, fine, in the wintertime. But when in the wintertime is the best time to go? Well, it's going to depend on a number of things. It's going to depend on exactly when the kids have vacation from school. It's going to depend on exactly when our workload is going to be the lightest at work. It's going to depend on when we save up the money for the vacation. So we have to think about when would be the best time in the wintertime to go. But if you ask us, do we have any plans for travel? Well, we could say, yeah, we plan to go to Jamaica this winter. Well, when this winter, you might want to know? December 24th or December 28th or December 31st? When? Well, we might say we don't know exactly when, but sometime this winter. Okay, now our answer to you is vague. We say sometime this winter. Not clear exactly when. Well, you might say, okay, but even that could be made precise. You could say, well, we plan to travel to Jamaica between the following dates, December 21st and March 21st. Well, but our plans aren't even that precise because maybe when we look at all the availability, it'll turn out that March 22nd is the best day to go. Or maybe March 23rd, or maybe December 20th. Right? So we can't even make our plans as precise as all that. So if we're going to answer your question, we have to give you a vague answer. We can't give you a precise answer. We could try to give you a precise answer in probabilistic terms. We could say, well, there's a high probability that we'll go in January or February, there's a lower probability that we'll go in December or March, and there's a very low probability that we'll go in early December or late March. But wait a second. Even there, our answer wasn't precise. We were talking about a high probability, a lower probability. What exactly counts as a high probability? Is it a probability greater than 50%? So it's hard for us to answer your question with any precision. So if we can't answer your question with any precision, should we just remain completely uninformative? And when you ask, do we have any plans for travel? We should just say, we don't know. Well, that seems unhelpful. It seems much more helpful to give you a vague answer. Yeah, we're planning to go to Jamaica sometime this winter. That's much more helpful than giving you a response of the form, we don't know. Or, of course, we could just make up a precise answer and say, yes, we plan to go to Jamaica on December 28th. But then we'd be lying, because we have no idea whether or not we plan to go to Jamaica on December 28th. Or if not lying, in any case, we'd be saying something that we haven't the foggiest idea whether or not it's true. So, in order for us to answer your question helpfully, we have to give a vague answer. And that's just one example out of many I could have produced of a case where, in order to be conversationally cooperative, we have to say something vague. So vagueness is important to ordinary language. So is ambiguity, because one of the ways that we generate ambiguity is through metaphor and through figurative language generally. If I say, the White House said today that the conflict in Afghanistan is expected to decrease over the next 12 months. Well, you might say, what do I mean the White House said? Does the White House have any organ that allows it to speak? No, the White House is just a building. Buildings can't speak. Well, sure, you could say buildings can't speak, but when I say the White House said, I meant a particular office said. Oh wait, you might object, an office said? What do you mean, a room with walls and a ceiling said something? Well, no. A room with walls and a ceiling didn't say something, but a particular person or group of people who work in that room with walls and a ceiling said something. Oh, which people were those? Well, I don't know. I don't know if it was President Obama who said it, or if it was his White House press spokesperson, or if it was some other member of the administration. But I don't need to know in order to answer your question helpfully when I say the White House said it. So, there I'm using the phrase the White House in a different sense than it's literally intended, right? The literal meaning of the White House is to refer to a particular building. Now I'm using the phrase the White House to refer to a particular group of people who said something, but I can't be any more specific than that. I don't know which among those people said it, so I just say the White House said it. Okay, so these are examples of how vagueness and ambiguity are actually useful to ordinary language. They're useful to the language that we speak in day-to-day life. So we can't get rid of them, and we shouldn't get rid of them. They're useful. But the problem is, as long as they exist in ordinary language, it's going to be very easy to make fallacies of vagueness and ambiguity. And so we're going to have to look out for such fallacies when they occur. Now, with the fallacies that we'll be talking about this week, fallacies of relevance and vacuity, they are not like that. Fallacies of relevance and vacuity are much easier to root out once we know what they are. There's nothing about our ordinary language that tempts us into making fallacies of relevance and vacuity. Once we've identified what they are, we should be able to eliminate them. So what are fallacies of relevance and vacuity? Well, I'll start out today by giving you some definitions, and then in subsequent lectures, we'll talk about particular examples. So, fallacies of relevance and vacuity. First, what's a fallacy of relevance? A fallacy of relevance is a fallacy that results when an argument's premises are not relevant at all to supporting its conclusion. Now, examples of these sorts of fallacies are what we're going to call ad hominem arguments, appeals to authority, and appeals to popular opinion. And we're going to be discussing all of those in subsequent lectures. What's an example of a fallacy of vacuity? Well, first let me give you a definition. Fallacy of vacuity is a fallacy that results when you can't be justified in accepting the premises of an argument unless you're already independently justified in accepting the conclusion. So in other words, even if the argument is sound, the premises can't give you a good reason for accepting the conclusion because you already have to have a good reason for accepting the conclusion in order to accept the premises in the first place. And examples of those are what we're going to call circularity, begging the question, and self-sealing. And again, in subsequent lectures, we'll look at examples of all of those. Okay, see you next time. Today we're going to talk about a particular kind of fallacy of relevance known as an ad hominem argument. Now, those of you who know Latin will know that ad hominem means to the person. But what kind of a fallacy is an ad hominem fallacy? Well, as is suggested by the name, an ad hominem fallacy is one that begins with premises about a particular person who's making an argument and ends with a conclusion that's critical of that person's argument. It's critical of that person's argument solely on the basis of premises having to do with that person, him or herself. I'll give you a simple example to show you what I mean. So suppose Takahashi has just given an eloquent presentation of some evidence that normalizing U.S. relations with Cuba would result in massive benefit to both nations. Both the United States and Cuba would be much better off if relations between the two countries were normalized. Okay, now, you might argue as follows. Well, Takahashi has just given this eloquent presentation, but Takahashi owns a cigar import business which stands to profit from the normalization of relations between the U.S. and Cuba. Therefore, we should disregard Takahashi's presentation. Okay, now that's an example of an ad hominem argument, right? You're arguing from a premise about Takahashi, him or herself, right, that she stands to profit from normalization of relations, to the conclusion that whatever evidence was given in her presentation, we just shouldn't listen to it. We shouldn't bother with that evidence because, after all, Takahashi stands to profit. Okay, that's an example of an ad hominem argument. Now, there are three kinds of ad hominem argument that I think it's worth distinguishing. And those three kinds of ad hominem argument correspond to three different things that a person is doing whenever they give an argument. Let's think about what you're doing when you give an argument. Well, when you give an argument, let's say when you give an argument to a particular audience, right, you're trying to persuade them of something. First of all, your behavior implies that you're entitled to put forth claims about the issue in question, right? So if I give an argument, let's say I give an argument to the effect that housing prices in the southeastern states in the United States are going to rise by over 10% over the coming year. Well, one thing I'm doing when I give that argument is implying by my behavior that I'm entitled to have an opinion about that. I'm entitled to put forth claims about that. I have whatever knowledge it would take to be in a position to put forth claims about that. Right? If I'm completely ignorant about the housing market and its vicissitudes, then I shouldn't be making any such claims at all. If I'm completely ignorant about the vicissitudes of the housing market, then I'm in no position to be making any such argument. So one thing I'm doing when I make an argument is that I'm implying that I'm entitled to put forth claims about the issue in question. The second thing I'm doing when I make an argument is implying that certain premises, namely the premises that I'm giving in my argument, support the conclusion that I'm offering. Right? That the premises that I'm giving are true and bear some relation of support to that conclusion. Maybe the argument from those premises to that conclusion is a valid argument, maybe it's just a probabilistically strong argument, but in any case, the premises offer some support for the conclusion. That's another thing I'm implying when I give the argument. And then, of course, the third thing is I'm claiming the conclusion is true. So those are three things that I'm doing whenever I give any argument, whenever I try to prove any point. I'm doing at least those three things. And corresponding to each one of those three things, there's a kind of ad hominem argument that denies that I've successfully executed that thing. Okay, so let's look at the three kind of ad hominem arguments corresponding to these three things that I'm doing whenever I give an argument. Okay, so the first kind of ad hominem argument is what I call a silencer. That's an argument that begins with some premises about a person who's making a point, giving an argument, and ends with a conclusion to the effect that we should disregard that person's argument altogether. It's not that the person's argument is valid or invalid or that their conclusion is true or false or what. Just we shouldn't pay any attention at all, right? Because the person isn't entitled to give any argument on this issue. So we shouldn't even worry about whether their argument is valid or invalid or whether their conclusion is true or not because the person isn't entitled to speak on the issue. That's what a silencer argument does. Okay? So a silencer argument basically denies that it really is entitled to put forth claims about the issue, that they really have successfully executed what they would have to have done in order for one to be true. Okay. A second kind of ad hominem argument is called a dismisser. A dismisser begins with premises about a particular person who's making a point or giving an argument, and ends with a conclusion to the effect that that person's reasons, the reasons they're giving in defense of that point, are not good reasons. A dismisser doesn't say that the conclusion of their argument is false. A dismisser just says their reasons are no good. So don't pay any attention to their argument because the premises given in support of their conclusion don't actually support their conclusion. Maybe the premises are false or maybe they're just irrelevant to the conclusion, but don't pay any attention because, after all, their conclusion, whether true or false, is unsupported by their argument. So that's what a dismisser does. A dismisser, in short, is an argument to the effect that the person that you're attacking hasn't successfully executed task 2 that they have to perform whenever giving an argument. They might imply that certain premises support a conclusion on the issue, but they're wrong. Those premises don't actually support that conclusion. Maybe because they're false or maybe because they're irrelevant to the conclusion. Okay. Finally, the third kind of ad hominem argument is called a denier. Now, a denier is an argument that begins with some premises about a particular person who's making a point and ends with a conclusion that denies the conclusion of that other person's argument. In other words, whatever you have to say about their entitlement to speak on the issue, whatever you have to say about the truth of their premises or the relevance of their premises, a denier claims that the conclusion that they reach is false. So a denier says that the person hasn't successfully executed task 3 that's associated with giving an argument. They claim that the conclusion is true, but their claim is wrong. Okay, so those are the 3 kind of ad hominem arguments corresponding to the 3 things that a person is doing whenever they're giving an argument. Next time, we're going to look in more detail at each of those kinds of ad hominem arguments. In particular, next time, we'll examine silencer arguments, and then we'll look at dismissers and deniers. See you next time. In the last class, we talked about ad hominem arguments, and we distinguished 3 varieties of ad hominem arguments. Today, we're going to talk about the first variety of those 3, the variety that we call silencers. Now, I should point out that while ad hominem arguments are typically fallacies, not all of them are fallacies. And the same holds true of silencers. While silencers are typically fallacies, not all of them are fallacies. So what I'm going to do today is first give a definition of silencers, then give some examples of silencers that are not fallacies, and finally we'll talk about silencers that are fallacies, which are the most common kind of silencers. Okay, so first, what's a silencer? Well, a silencer is an ad hominem argument that begins with some premises about a particular person who's making a point, and it ends with a conclusion to the effect that we should disregard that person's argument altogether. The conclusion is not the person's argument is an argument for a false conclusion, or their premises are false, or their premises don't support their conclusion. The conclusion is just we shouldn't pay any attention to their argument at all. Now, I can give a couple of examples of silencers that are actually good arguments, that are not fallacies. But in order to give these examples, I have to describe environments that tend to operate in a very strictly regulated framework. So I'll start by giving some examples of silencers that are not fallacies, and then we'll look at silencers that are fallacies. So first, here's a silencer that's not a fallacy. So suppose you're in a court of law during a criminal trial, and the accused is on the witness stand. The person who's accused of some heinous crime is on the witness stand. Let's say the accused has been accused of murder. And as always, the defense gets to call some witnesses and the prosecution gets to call some witnesses, and there's a procedure that governs the progress of criminal trials. Right? Criminal trials operate according to a certain procedure. Now suppose that someone bursts into the room, someone who hasn't been called by either the defense or the prosecution, someone bursts into the room and then yells at the top of their lungs, "I saw the accused murder the victim. Therefore, the accused is guilty of the crime with which she is charged." Okay, now, this person who's just burst into the courtroom and presented this argument, this person might be presenting an argument that's sound. Indeed, it might be that the person saw the accused murder the victim. And it might be that the accused is guilty of the crime with which she is charged. So the argument that's being presented by the intruder, the person who bursts into the courtroom, might be a perfectly sound argument. But that doesn't mean we should listen to it. In fact, at least in American criminal trials, it's very likely that the judge would instruct the jury to disregard the outburst in the courtroom, because that has not been presented as evidence by either the prosecution or the defense. Criminal trials have to operate according to a certain procedure. If the procedure is violated, then a mistrial is declared, or there has to be some way of fixing the violation of the procedure. And for someone to just burst into the courtroom, not called there by either the prosecution or the defense, and to yell out that they saw the accused murder the victim and therefore the accused really is guilty of the crime with which she is charged, well, the argument that they're giving might be sound. It might be that the premise is true and the conclusion is true, and of course the premise supports the conclusion, but that doesn't mean we should listen to it. In fact, the jury will very likely be specifically instructed to disregard the outburst. So there's an example of a silencer that is not a fallacy. If I say the outburst was inappropriate and violates the procedure of the criminal trial, therefore we should disregard it. Right there, I'm giving an argument. The argument is a silencer. It starts off with a premise about the person who made the outburst, namely that their making the outburst was in violation of the procedure of the criminal trial, and it ends with a conclusion to the effect that we should disregard their argument. So what I've just given right now is a silencer, but that's a silencer that's actually a good argument. In that context, we should ignore the outburst. Okay. Or certainly the jury should ignore the outburst. Okay, so that's an example of a silencer that's not a fallacy. It's a good argument. Here's another example of a silencer that's not a fallacy. So suppose in a particular session of our national legislature, a bill, proposed law is being debated by different legislators. And suppose someone bursts into the legislative assembly and makes the following outburst. This bill will throw millions of working citizens into dire poverty. Any bill that throws millions of working citizens into dire poverty should not be passed into law, and therefore this bill should not be passed into law. Now again, it's possible, let's suppose, that the argument that this person is giving is a sound argument. It's possible that the premises are both true and that the conclusion is true and that the premises support the conclusion. But even if it's a sound argument, given the way legislative sessions are supposed to operate, we shouldn't listen to the argument that this person is given because the way they gave it violates the protocol of legislative sessions. Right? So I might argue as follows. I might say, this person's outburst violates the protocol of our legislative session. Therefore, we must disregard their argument. That's an example of a silencer, and yet it's not a bad argument. It might very well be true, given the rules governing legislative activity, that we do need to disregard this outburst. That doesn't mean that we don't need to think about the considerations that the person adduced. We might need to think about the considerations that the person adduced, but that would be for other reasons than that the person adduced them. So this is an example of a silencer that's actually a good argument. It's a good argument for the conclusion that we should ignore the outburst that the person made into the legislative session. Okay, so now I've given a couple of examples of silencers that are good arguments. But notice, these silencers occur in very special circumstances. Let's say during a criminal trial or during a legislative session, during some occasion that's governed by a bunch of procedural rules and regulations. But ordinary life isn't like that. In ordinary life, our conversations aren't governed by that thick network of procedural rules and regulations. Of course, there are rules and regulations that govern ordinary conversation, rules and regulations concerning etiquette, being reasonably polite and considerate to one another. Those rules and regulations are few enough and far between that we still leave room for people outside our conversation to burst out with consideration. But those regulations are not as many and not as complicated as the rules and regulations that govern legal proceedings and legislative sessions. In ordinary life, when do we encounter silencers? Well, often we encounter silencers of the following form. We'll encounter a silencer to the effect that we shouldn't listen to someone's argument because, after all, that person has a criminal record. Or we shouldn't listen to someone's argument because, after all, that person is a philanderer. Or we shouldn't listen to someone's argument because, after all, we all know what that person is like. That person is just weird. And so we just shouldn't listen to their argument. So often in ordinary life, we encounter silencers that are fallacies. They tell us not to listen to the argument that a person is giving, not because that argument, the act that they performed of giving that argument, violates the strict rules and regulations governing our proceedings. We shouldn't listen to their argument because that person is weird, or that person has some event in their history that should make us look askance at them. Now, those silencers typically are fallacies, and yet those are the kinds of silencers that we find most commonly in everyday life. Okay, so that's our discussion of silencers. Next time, we'll talk about dismissers. See you next time. In the last class, we talked about an ad hominem argument called a silencer. And we said that while there are some silencers that are good arguments, a lot of them that are given in everyday life are bad arguments. They're fallacies. Today I want to talk about another kind of ad hominem argument, an ad hominem argument called a dismisser. I want to say what dismissers are. I want to give some examples of dismissers that actually are pretty good arguments, but then I want to give some examples of dismissers that occur in everyday life that are bad arguments. Okay, so let's start by defining what dismissers are. So, as I said, a dismisser is a kind of ad hominem argument. It begins with premises about a particular person who's making a point, and it ends with a conclusion to the effect that that person's reasons for that point are not good reasons. Right? So a dismisser is not a silencer. It's not saying the person has no right to speak about the issue. It's not saying that we should just disregard anything they have to say about the issue. Fine, they're entitled to speak about the issue. Maybe we should listen to what they have to say about the issue, but we should not regard the reasons that they give as good reasons. That's the point of a dismisser. Now, as I said, there are some dismissers that are good arguments. Let's consider a couple of examples. First, consider the following argument. Right? Let's suppose we've just watched an advertisement in which a coalition of companies in the fossil fuel industry are giving an argument in the ad to the effect that climate change is a hoax. In fact, there's no significant man-made climate change taking place in the environment today. Now, we might argue as follows. Okay, premise: the fossil fuel industry is eager to operate under as little environmental regulation as possible. That's true of all companies that are interested in turning a profit. Conclusion: therefore, any reason that the members of the fossil fuel industry give in support of the conclusion that climate change is a hoax are unlikely to provide strong support for that conclusion. Okay, now that argument, I claim, is a good one. It's a dismisser where you're arguing from the interests of the fossil fuel industry to the conclusion that we should take whatever reasons they give in defense of their conclusion that climate change is a hoax. We should take those reasons with a grain of salt. We should be suspicious of them. Now, of course, that's not to say for a moment that we should simply deny those reasons or deny the conclusion that climate change is a hoax. That's a substantive question that requires climatological expertise to answer. But while we leave it open as a possibility that the argument being made by members of the fossil fuel industry is in fact a sound argument, we only leave it open as a possibility. We recognize that what's very likely to be true, given their interests, is that the argument that they're making is not a good argument. Possibly it is. We have to investigate. But based on what we know now about the interests of the fossil fuel industry, it very likely is not a good argument. Okay, so Let's give another example of a dismisser that's a good argument. Let's suppose the head of a particular bureaucracy is arguing that cuts to that bureaucracy's operating budget would be absolutely devastating. In fact, given the centrality of that bureaucracy's mission, it's in fact crucial that their operating budget be at least maintained and preferably significantly grown. Okay, now we might give the following dismisser argument. We might say, look, the head of that bureaucracy is eager to have as large an operating budget as possible under her control. That's her job, is to gather as many resources as possible and harness them in the service of whatever purposes she sets out to achieve. But from that we could draw the conclusion that any reasons that she gives in support of the conclusion that her department, her bureaucracy, needs to maintain or grow its current budget, those reasons are unlikely to provide strong support for that conclusion. Again, that leaves it open. Perhaps the conclusion is true. Perhaps even the reasons provide strong support for that conclusion. And certainly she's entitled to have an opinion on the issue. She's entitled to sound off on the issue. But we should be suspicious of her argument given the interest that she has, given her powerful personal interest in increasing the size of her operating budget. We should be very suspicious of the reasons that she gives. We should assume that they're false unless we have good reason to believe that they're true. We should assume that they don't support her conclusion unless we have good reason to believe that they do. Okay, so these are some examples of dismisser ad hominem arguments that are actually pretty good arguments. But more often than not, dismissers are given in everyday life that are not good arguments, that are fallacies. We might dismiss someone's reasons for a particular conclusion, not because we detect that that person's own interests, let's say their professional interests or their financial interests, determine that they would give this argument in favor of this conclusion, but rather because that person has some feature that maybe we don't like. Maybe we think they're too smart by half, or maybe there's something about them that strikes us as suspicious. We can't quite put our finger on it, but maybe they just seem vaguely, I don't know, European. Something like that. And we on account of that feature, we suspect that whatever argument they're giving is not a good argument. Okay, those are examples of dismissers that are fallacies. Let's consider some examples of those now. In the last two lectures, we talked about two different kinds of ad hominem arguments. There were silencers and dismissers. In this lecture, we're going to talk about the third and final kind of ad hominem argument that we'll be discussing in this course. These are called deniers. So let's start off with the definition of deniers, and then we'll give some examples of deniers that actually are good arguments, followed by some examples of deniers that are fallacies. Okay, so first, what's a denier? Well, a denier is a kind of ad hominem argument that begins with premises about a particular person who's making a point, right? That's what makes it an ad hominem. And it ends with a conclusion denying the point that that person is making, denying the conclusion of that person's argument. It's not saying the person isn't authorized or entitled to speak on the issue. It's not saying that the reasons the person presents in favor of their conclusion are somehow defective, false, insufficiently supportive of the conclusion. Rather, it's saying independently of any of that, the conclusion is false. The conclusion that that person is coming to is false. So that's how a denier works. Let me give you some examples of deniers that are actually good arguments. So here's one. Suppose that Arthur performs the following speech act. I don't know why Arthur would do this, but let's just suppose he does. He says, "I am an inveterate liar, and most of the time I speak falsely, including now. Therefore, this very statement is false." Okay, now, if that's what Arthur says, then we can conclude that the point that Arthur is making, the conclusion that Arthur is drawing from his argument, is not true. Because the conclusion that he's drawing from his argument is, this very statement is false. But the problem is, if it's true that this very statement is false, then that means that that statement really is false, in which case it's not true. So it can't be true that this very statement is false. In other words, Arthur's conclusion, the conclusion that Arthur reaches at the end of his argument, is not true. Now, we just proved that. So, we just proved that by thinking about the performance that Arthur gave, where he was making a speech act with that content. He said, I'm an inveterate liar. Most of the time I speak falsely, even now. Therefore, this very statement is false. When Arthur says that, we can prove that the conclusion that he's reaching is not true. So there's an example of a denier. It starts with a premise about a particular person, in this case, Arthur, and it's a premise about what Arthur does, and it ends with a conclusion to the effect that the conclusion that Arthur drew is not true. So it denies the conclusion that Arthur drew. So there's an example of a denier ad hominem argument, but that argument actually is a good one. If Arthur issues that particular verbal performance, then the conclusion that he draws is not true. Okay, so there's an example of a denier that's a good argument. Here's another example of a denier that's a good argument. Suppose that Sybil is arguing in front of, let's say, her university's honor court, that her classmate Susan cheated on some exam that both Sybil and Susan took. Now, I might argue as follows. Look, in her argument, Sybil did provide a lot of evidence that Susan cheated on the exam. But though Sybil's evidence may seem compelling, in fact, Sybil herself is an unrepentant cheater who repeatedly tries to hide her tracks. She tries to disguise her cheating by planting evidence of cheating on innocent classmates. Therefore, I conclude, Sybil's conclusion itself, to the effect that Susan cheated, Sybil's conclusion is probably not true. Susan probably did not cheat, despite the evidence that Sybil has presented against her, because Sybil does have this track record of planting evidence on innocent classmates. Okay, there also is an example of a denier argument. It starts with a premise about a particular person, in this case Sybil, and it ends with a conclusion to the effect that Sybil's own conclusion is false, or at least probably false. So it doesn't say Sybil isn't authorized to speak on the issue of cheating. It doesn't say that Sybil's evidence doesn't support her conclusion. It just says that regardless of Sybil's entitlement to speak on the issue and the support that her evidence lends to her conclusion is false, or at least probably false. So that's another example of a denier argument. And there again, we have a denier argument that seems like a pretty good argument. It's not deductively valid, but it's a pretty strong argument nonetheless. It's a strong inductive argument nonetheless. Okay, so those are examples of good denier arguments. But we have to search far and wide to find examples of good denier arguments. What we find more often, especially when we look through the media, are examples of bad denier arguments. Denier arguments in which we conclude that someone else's argument leads to a false conclusion, and we draw that conclusion based on features of the person that are really irrelevant to the truth of the conclusion that they're arguing for. We'll see some examples of that right now. In the last few lectures, we've been looking at the varieties of ad hominem argument. And in particular, we've looked at a bunch of examples of ad hominem fallacies and the different kinds of ad hominem fallacies. Today, I want to start on a new but related topic. The new topic is appeals to authority. So first let me define appeals to authority and make it clear precisely how appeals to authority are related to ad hominem arguments. So first, what's an appeal to authority? So an appeal to authority is a kind of argument that begins with premises about a particular person who's making a claim and ends with a conclusion that endorses that person's claim. In a way, you could think of an appeal to authority as the opposite of an ad hominem argument, right? Remember, an ad hominem argument is one that starts with premises about a particular person who's making a claim and then ends with a conclusion that is opposed to that person's claim. In an appeal to authority, you start with the same sorts of premises, but you end with a conclusion that is in favor of that person's claim. Okay, so here's an example of an appeal to authority. It's a particularly egregious example, not one that anyone would be consciously guilty of making, but still an example to give us the rough idea. So, premise one, Takahashi has just given an eloquent presentation of evidence that normalizing U.S. relations with Cuba will result in benefit to both nations. Premise two, Takahashi's presentation was extremely eloquent and she was very well dressed. Conclusion, we should accept Takahashi's conclusion to the effect that normalizing relations between the United States and Cuba will result in benefit to both countries. Okay, so that's an example of an appeal to authority. It's an argument that begins with premises about a particular person, in this case premises about how eloquent Takahashi was and how well dressed she was. Right? So we start off with premises like that and we end with a conclusion, so we should believe her. We should accept her conclusion because after all, she was so well dressed and eloquent. Okay, now as I said, that's a very egregious example of an appeal to authority. But appeals to authority all have that structure. They start with premises about a particular person, and they end with a conclusion to the effect that what that person said is especially credible, should get special weight. Okay, so appeals to authority, like ad hominem arguments, come in three kinds, corresponding to the three jobs that someone is doing whenever they give an argument or whenever they try to prove a point. Remember, the three things that someone is doing whenever they give an argument or try to prove a point are these. First, they're implying that they are entitled to put forth claims about the issue. Right? If I'm putting forth claims about an issue, then my behavior implies that I'm entitled to do so. Second, the person who's putting forth claims about an issue, is making an argument about an issue, is implying that the premises that they're giving actually do support the conclusion that they're drawing. Right? I wouldn't be giving certain premises in support of my conclusion unless I believed that those premises really did support that conclusion. So, for me to give certain premises in support of a conclusion is to imply that those premises really do support that conclusion. I might not be saying that the premises support that conclusion, but my behavior clearly implies that I think so. Okay, finally, of course, when you give an argument in favor of a certain conclusion, you're claiming that the conclusion is true. That's part of the point of arguing for a conclusion. You're trying to prove the conclusion, establish it, claim that it's true. Okay, well, corresponding to these three things that people do when they give arguments, there are three different kinds of appeals to authority that we can make. Right? We can make a kind of appeal to authority that I call an amplifier. An amplifier is an argument that begins with premises about a particular person who's making a point and ends with a conclusion to the effect that we should place great weight or place great credence on the point that the person is making, right? That person is somehow especially entitled to speak on the issue, that they have some special authority that makes their argument deserving of our attention. That's an amplifier. Or we could give an appeal to authority argument that I call a supporter. A supporter is an argument that begins with premises about a particular person who's making a point and ends with a conclusion to the effect that the reasons that the person is giving in support of their point are especially compelling reasons. And finally, there's a kind of appeal to authority that I call an affirmer. When you give an affirmer, you're giving an argument that begins with premises about a particular person who's making a point, and you end with a conclusion that affirms the point that person is making, a conclusion that supports that person's conclusion, insists that that person's conclusion is true, or at least very probably true. Okay, so these are three different kinds of appeals to authority, and again, they correspond, just as the three different kinds of ad hominem argument corresponded to the three different things that someone is doing when they give an argument, right? The three different kinds of ad hominem argument were three different ways of arguing that the person who was making a point hadn't successfully executed one of these three jobs. The three different kinds of appeals to authority are three different ways of arguing that a particular person who's making an argument has successfully executed one or another of these three different jobs. Okay, so those are the three kinds of appeals to authority. In the next lecture, we'll talk about amplifiers. We'll give some examples of amplifiers that are good arguments, and then some examples of amplifiers which, occurring more routinely, are bad arguments. Okay, see you next time. In the last class, we distinguished three kinds of appeals to authority, and today I want to talk about the first of those three kinds, a kind of argument that we'll call amplifiers. What's an amplifier? We'll define it, and then we'll consider a couple of examples. First, we'll consider examples of amplifiers that are actually good arguments, and then we'll look at some amplifiers that are bad arguments. Okay, so first, here's the definition. What's an amplifier? An amplifier is an argument that begins with premises about a particular person who's making a point, and it ends with a conclusion to the effect that we should place great weight or lend great credence to the person's point, right? Whatever the person is saying, they have a special entitlement. They're especially authoritative to say it. Okay, so that's an amplifier. Now, I said sometimes amplifiers are good arguments. To see an example of a couple of amplifiers, both of which are good arguments, I'd like you to look at the following clip.
And the funny part of it is, Marshall McLuhan, you don't know anything about Marshall McLuhan's work.
Really? I happen to teach a class at Columbia called TV, Media, and Culture. So I think that my insights into Mr. McLuhan, well, have a great deal of validity.
Oh, do you?
Okay, now, in that clip, we saw a person who was a Columbia University professor arguing as follows, implicitly arguing as follows. I teach a class on media and popular culture at Columbia University. Therefore, you should lend great credence to my views on the issues of which I speak. That seemed to be the argument that the person was making. That's why he brought up the fact that he teaches a class on media and popular culture at Columbia University in order to lend credence to his views on the topic. Okay, now it's true that if someone is a Columbia University professor who teaches a particular topic, that does tend to establish some credibility that they might have on that topic. But while that might be a good amplifier argument, it doesn't prove that its conclusion is true, and to see that it doesn't prove, not conclusively anyway, that its conclusion is true, we need to look at the rest of that clip and consider another amplifier argument that occurs in the rest of that clip, right here.
Because I happen to have Mr. McLuhan right here. So, yeah, just let me come over here a second.
Oh,
Tell him.
I heard what you were saying. You know nothing of my work. You mean my whole fallacy is wrong. How you ever got to teach a course in anything is totally amazing.
Boy, if life were only like this.
Okay, so what's happening there? What's happening there is that Marshall McLuhan himself appears. Now, Woody Allen, like the rest of us, can reason as follows. Marshall McLuhan himself is the world's most noted living expert on popular media and culture. or at least he was at the time that that movie was made. Therefore, we should lend great credence to whatever it is that Marshall McLuhan says on that topic. Unfortunately, since what Marshall McLuhan says on that topic is directly opposed to what the Columbia University professor says on that topic, the conclusion of our first amplifier argument is a conclusion that gets overridden by this second amplifier argument. Okay, so you have two amplifier arguments that occur in that clip that I just showed. Both amplifier arguments are good arguments. They're not sound arguments, they're not deductively sound, but they're inductively strong. But as we saw in Unit 3 of the course, an inductively strong argument can still have a false conclusion. This is a case where we have two inductively strong arguments. They can't both have a true conclusion. One of them must have a false conclusion. And it appears that our second amplifier argument overrides our first. So here's a case where we have two good amplifier arguments. But good amplifier arguments are pretty few and far between. More often in daily life, we find bad amplifier arguments. Today we're going to talk about another kind of appeal to authority that we call a supporter. We're going to define what supporters are, give a couple of examples of good supporter arguments, and then talk about some bad supporter arguments, some supporter fallacies. So first, what are supporters? Well, supporters are arguments that begin with premises about a particular person who's making a point, and they end with a conclusion to the effect that the person's reasons for their point are especially compelling, especially good reasons. Maybe the reasons are likely to be true, or maybe they're especially likely to support the conclusion, but in whatever way, they're especially good reasons. Okay, now sometimes supporter arguments are good arguments. Let me give a couple of examples. So suppose I argue as follows. Premise 1, Warren Buffett has argued that confidence in the dollar will rise and therefore the price of gold will soon fall. Premise 2, when Warren Buffett speaks, investors listen and believe. Therefore, conclusion, confidence in the dollar will probably rise. Right? So the reason that Warren Buffett gave in support of his conclusion that the price of gold will fall, namely that confidence in the dollar will rise, that reason is especially likely to be true. Why is it especially likely to be true? Well, I'm saying it's especially likely to be true because Warren Buffett said it was especially likely to be true. And when Warren Buffett says it, that makes it true because investors listen to what he says and they believe in him. And if investors all believe that other people are going to be confident in the dollar, then investors will all be confident in the dollar. Okay, so there's an example of a supporter argument. I start off with premises about a particular person. In this case, Warren Buffett. I start off with a premise to the effect that he's listened to by investors. Investors believe what he says. And I end up with a conclusion that the reason Warren Buffett gives in support of his conclusion that the price of gold will fall, that reason is an especially good reason. In this case, it's especially likely to be true that confidence in the dollar will rise. So there's an example of a supporter argument that's a good argument. Here's another example. Premise 1. Isaac Mizrahi says that given how constricted pants have become in recent fashion, many people will now want to bring back bell-bottom pants. Premise 2. Isaac Mizrahi is one of the trendsetters in the fashion industry. That's what I gather from Googling things on the internet, but maybe one of you knows better. Conclusion, it's true that many people will experience today's pants as constricting and come to see bell-bottom pants as trendy. Okay, now that's a supporter argument. It starts off by stating a premise about Isaac Mizrahi and the central place that he occupies in today's fashion industry. And it ends up with a conclusion to the effect that the reason Isaac Mizrahi gives for his conclusion that bell-bottom pants are soon coming back, the reason that he gives is a reason that's especially likely to be true. Why is it especially likely to be true that people are going to experience today's pants as constricting? Well, it's especially likely to be true because Isaac Mizrahi said it was true. And if Isaac Mizrahi says that people are going to experience pants as constricting, then that's going to make it more likely to be true, because people who follow fashion feel about clothes roughly the way Isaac Mizrahi says they should feel about clothes. And so if Isaac Mizrahi says that they're going to experience today's pants as constricting, then very likely they will experience today's pants as constricting. And so they will demand a return of bell-bottom pants. Okay, so there's another supporter argument. And once again, I think this supporter argument is a good argument. It's not a deductively sound argument, but it's a good argument. Okay, so there are some examples of good supporter arguments. It's a lot easier to find examples of bad supporter arguments, of supporter fallacies. And we can see some of those right now. In the last couple of lectures, we've talked about a couple different kinds of appeals to authority argument, amplifiers and supporters. Today we're going to wrap up our discussion of appeals to authority by talking about the third kind of appeal to authority argument, affirmers. So what's an affirmer? Once again, let me give a definition, give some examples of affirmers that are, at least arguably, good arguments, and finally we'll look at some examples of affirmers that are not good arguments, that are fallacies. Okay, so first, what's an affirmer? An affirmer is an argument that begins with a premise about a particular person who's making a point, says something about that person, and the argument ends with a conclusion that affirms that person's point, that endorses the conclusion that the person is drawing. So an affirmer doesn't say anything about the person's entitlement or authority on the issue. The affirmer doesn't say anything about the strength or quality of the person's reasons in support of their point. The affirmer just says, well, they said it, roughly, so whatever conclusion they drew is true. That's the basic form of an affirmer. Okay, let's start with a couple of examples of affirmers that are, as I said, at least arguably, good arguments. Okay, the first example is very similar to an example that we saw last time with supporters. There is a difference, though. So here's an affirmer version of the argument about Warren Buffett that we considered in the last class. Premise 1, Warren Buffett has argued that confidence in the dollar will rise and that therefore the price of gold will soon fall. Premise 2, when Warren Buffett speaks, investors listen and believe. Okay, now those two premises are the same as the two premises of the supporter argument about Warren Buffett that we considered last time. But here the conclusion is different. Here the conclusion is, therefore the price of gold will soon fall. So here the conclusion is not that Warren Buffett's reasons for his claim are good. It's not that, in fact, confidence in the dollar will rise, or that the rise in the confidence of the dollar is supportive of a drop in the price of gold. The conclusion is simply that Warren Buffett's conclusion that the price of gold will soon fall, that conclusion is true. Okay, so the difference between this affirmer argument and that supporter argument might not seem very significant. This is an example of an argument that could be spun both as an affirmer and as a supporter, but sometimes the difference between an affirmer and a supporter does matter, as in this next example. Suppose you argue as follows. The Pope argues that masturbation is carnal misuse of one's body, and that therefore it's a sin. Conclusion, therefore masturbation is a sin. Now, there's some people, I think over 1 billion of them, who believe in the infallibility of the Pope. And if you're one of those people, then you will think that this is a good argument. I am not taking a view on whether or not it's a good argument, at least not for the purposes of this class, but my point is that if you accept papal infallibility, then you're going to think that this is a good argument. But notice, you're going to think that this is a good argument even if you have no understanding whatsoever of what the Pope means when he speaks of carnal misuse of one's body, even if that phrase is completely opaque to you. So you have no understanding at all of the Pope's reasons in support of his conclusion that masturbation is a sin. Still, You recognize the Pope has given some argument. To you, the argument sounds like this: blah, 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 masturbation is a sin. That's what the argument sounds like to you. But since you believe in the infallibility of the Pope, you think that whatever there is to say about the reasons that the Pope gave, the conclusion must be true. It must be true that masturbation is a sin, since after all the Pope said it and he argued for it. This is an example of an affirmer argument that is quite different from an analogous supporter argument where you conclude from the fact that the Pope gave a certain argument that the reasons that he gave in the course of that argument must be good. Right here, you're not drawing any conclusion about the Pope's reasons because you don't even understand the Pope's reasons. You don't know what carnal misuse of one's body is. Right? The only conclusion you're drawing is that the Pope's conclusion is true. And again, for those of you who believe in papal infallibility, this will look like a good argument, right? If the Pope is infallible and he argues that masturbation is a sin, then it must be a sin. Okay, so these are examples of affirmer arguments that are, at least arguably, good arguments. Now we can look at some examples of affirmer arguments that are not so good. Over the last few lectures, we've been talking about fallacies of relevance, including ad hominem arguments and appeals to authority. Today, I want to talk about a kind of argument that's similar to an appeal to authority, but not exactly the same. It's an appeal to popular opinion. Okay, so what's an appeal to popular opinion? Here, let me give a definition and then some examples. An appeal to popular opinion is an argument that begins with premises about the popularity of a particular claim and ends with a conclusion endorsing that claim. Roughly, an appeal to popular opinion is an argument of the form, well, everyone believes it, so it must be true. Now, some arguments of that form are actually good arguments. Let me give you some examples. So here's an argument, premise. Many people think, at least in my experience as a teacher, I found many people think that the verb to emulate is a synonym of the verb to imitate. Therefore, conclusion, at least one of the meanings of the verb to emulate is the same as the meaning of the verb to imitate. Now that's an appeal to popular opinion. It starts out saying what it is that a lot of people think, and then it draws a conclusion that what a lot of people think is true. But here, I think this is actually a pretty good argument. And the reason it's a good argument is because what the verb to emulate means depends, at least in part, on what the users of that verb take it to mean, what they use it to mean. And if people are using the verb to emulate to mean imitate, then at least one of the meanings of the verb to emulate becomes imitate. So popular opinion, in this example, popular opinion makes it true that the verb to emulate has at least one of the meanings that it has. Okay, here's another example in a different domain, but a similar sort of phenomenon where you have a good argument that's an appeal to popular opinion. So, premise, more and more merchants regard the local currency as losing value. Therefore, conclusion, the local currency is losing value. Once again, this is a pretty good argument, and it's a good argument because if more and more merchants regard the local currency as losing value, then they're not going to be as willing to trade their goods and services for the local currency. They will demand more of the local currency in exchange for their goods and services, or maybe they simply won't be willing to accept the local currency at all in exchange for their goods and services. And if that's true, then the local currency will lose value because each unit of the local currency will have less purchasing power. And so the local currency will lose value. Once again, here's a case where popular opinion makes true what it is that the people believe. Right? So this is a good argument. That's an example of an appeal to popular opinion. Not all appeals to popular opinion, though, are good arguments. Some of them are bad arguments. Some of them are fallacies. And let's take a look at some of those right now. We've devoted this week so far to talking about fallacies of relevance, but today we're going to talk about fallacies of vacuity. Let me begin by defining what a fallacy of vacuity is. A fallacy of vacuity is a fallacy that results when, roughly speaking, an argument starts by assuming what it's supposed to establish. You could think of it this way. A fallacy of vacuity is an argument that doesn't go anywhere. Its starting points presuppose what it is that the argument is supposed to prove. Okay, so there are different kinds of fallacies of vacuity. And in this lecture and the next, we're going to be talking about three different kinds of fallacies of vacuity. The first is something called circularity. A circular argument, a fallacy of circularity, occurs when an argument's conclusion is contained among its premises. You write out the premises of the argument, and one of the premises just is the conclusion. That's a circular argument, and that fallacy is called circularity. Another broader kind of fallacy of vacuity, when I say broader kind of fallacy of vacuity, I mean this kind of fallacy of vacuity includes circularity as a subspecies, is what's called begging the question. Begging the question is when an argument has the following feature. In order to be reasonable in believing the premises of that argument, you already have to have a good reason for believing the conclusion. So, unless you already have a good reason for believing the conclusion, independently of the premises, the argument can't go anywhere because you won't have a good reason for believing the premises. And so, if you don't have a good reason for believing the premises, then the argument can't give you a good reason for believing the conclusion. So roughly, an argument begs the question when you need to have a good reason for believing the conclusion already in order for you to have any reason to believe the premises of the argument. That's begging the question. Right? That includes circularity, because notice, in a circular argument, you have to have a good reason for believing the conclusion in order to have a good reason for believing the premises, because the conclusion is one of the premises. But begging the question can happen even without circularity, and we'll talk about examples of that next time. The last kind of fallacy of vacuity that I want to describe is something called self-sealing. Now, a self-sealer can be either a proposition or an argument, but roughly, a self-sealer is when a proposition or an argument is irrefutable by any possible consideration, no matter what. And so it doesn't rule out anything. So if I make some claim to the effect that at a certain point in time, you will then be doing exactly what you will be doing, you might think, well, yeah, so what does that tell me? What possible situations are ruled out by that statement? The answer is none. And so that statement is empty. It's vacuous. It's a self-sealer in the sense that there's no possible situation that it rules out, and so there's no possible consideration or evidence that could be brought forth against it. A self-sealing argument is one that commits a fallacy of vacuity because it does assume what it's intended to establish. Unfortunately, in a self-sealing argument, what it's intended to establish is nothing of any significance. It's nothing that rules out any possibility. And so it does tend to assume what it's supposed to establish. So, those are three kinds of vacuity that I want to distinguish. In the next lecture, we'll talk a bit more about circularity and begging the question, and in the lecture after that, we'll talk a bit more about self-sealing. See you next time. Now that we've introduced the topic of fallacies of vacuity, today we're going to talk about circularity and begging the question. So, what are these things? What is circularity and what is begging the question? Circularity is a fallacy that results when an argument's premises contain its conclusion, when the conclusion is right there among the premises. Now, this is a really egregious fallacy, not one that people are likely to make very often because it's so easy to notice. But let me give you an example, just so you can see what I'm talking about. So consider this simple example of circularity. Premise 1. this argument, this very argument, has a premise. Premise 2, this very argument has a conclusion. Therefore, conclusion, this argument has a conclusion. Now notice, the conclusion of that argument is the same proposition as premise 2 of that argument. In other words, the conclusion is right in the premises. That's a circular argument. That's an example of a fallacy of circularity. That's pretty hard to miss, and that's not the kind of fallacy that most people often make. But circularity is one very egregious example of a more general kind of fallacy that lots of people make, and that's called begging the question. So what's begging the question? Well, begging the question is a kind of fallacy that results when you can't have any reason for accepting the premises of the argument unless you already have some independent reason for believing the conclusion. Right? So in a certain sense, the argument assumes what it sets out to prove, because unless you already have a good reason for believing the conclusion to be true, you can't have a good reason for believing the premises to be true. And without having a good reason for believing the premises to be true, the argument can't give you any insight. It can't teach you anything. Right? No argument can teach you something unless you have a good reason for believing the premises of that argument to be true. So, that's the fallacy of begging the question. Now, what's an example of that? Well, these examples can be a little more subtle, right? Because not all forms of begging the question are circularity. Let me give an example of begging the question that doesn't involve circularity. So consider this argument. Again, it's a simple argument. The Pope says that he is infallible. Premise 2, whatever the Pope says is always right. Therefore, conclusion, the Pope is infallible. Now notice that argument is obviously valid. Right? If the Pope says that he's infallible and whatever he says is right, then he must be right to say that he's infallible. In fact, that's how the doctrine of papal infallibility was first established, was by papal decree. I'll let you look that up. Anyhow, if the premises of the argument are true, the conclusion has to be true. So the argument is valid. But even though the argument is valid, in fact, even if the argument is sound, the argument is still a fallacy. And the reason it's a fallacy is that we can't have any good reason for believing premise 2 of the argument unless we already have some reason, independently of the argument, for believing the conclusion. Right? Unless we already know that the Pope is infallible, why should we believe that whatever the Pope says is always right? Well, maybe there is some other reason, but unless that additional reason is supplied in the argument, this argument begs the question. It begs the question because it relies on premises that we have no reason to believe unless we already have a good reason to believe the conclusion independently of the argument itself. So this argument is an example of begging the question. But notice it's not an example of circularity. The conclusion of the argument that the Pope is infallible, that conclusion is not in the premises. It's not one of the premises. Right? There are two premises in the argument, and neither of those premises says precisely that the Pope is infallible. So this argument is an example of begging the question, but it's an example of begging the question that doesn't involve circularity. And that sort of fallacy is much harder to notice, much easier to make, and much more common in everyday life. You can see some examples right now. Today we're going to conclude our discussion of fallacies of vacuity by talking about self-sealers. So what's a self-sealer? Let me start by giving a definition and then giving some examples. So first, a self-sealer is a proposition or an argument that's irrefutable. It can't be refuted because it doesn't claim anything. It doesn't rule out any conceivable situation. So in that sense, it doesn't place any constraint on how the world has to be. Any possible way that the world is would conform to the proposition. So, what are some examples of that? Well, suppose someone says, and you might have heard philosophers who say this, suppose someone says, all human action is selfish. Now, at first, this seems like a a bold conjecture, a very substantial thesis that could be right or it could be wrong. Now, there's an obvious objection to this thesis. You say, well, look, what about self-sacrificing heroism? Occasionally, people will lay down their lives in the service of a cause that's larger than they are. Suppose you present this counterexample to the proponent of this generalization, and they say, well, look, even self-sacrificing heroism is itself motivated by the desire to be a hero. So the person who's performing the self-sacrificing heroism is still really acting selfishly because they're just trying to satisfy their own personal desire to be a hero. Some people want chocolate, and so they go out to get chocolate. Some people want to be a hero, so they go out looking to be a hero. Okay, well, suppose we decide to investigate this further. We find people who are who tend to engage in self-sacrificing heroic behavior, maybe people who are lucky enough to have engaged in such behavior in the past and they're still alive. And so we find such people and we test them in various ways. We do brain scans of them, we give them various surveys, we do behavioral tests on them, trying to test whether or not they have the desire to be a hero. And all our tests come up empty-handed. We just don't find any evidence. No matter how many tests we perform, we don't find any evidence that this person or these people really do have the desire to be a hero. They just aren't thinking about being a hero. They just want to save the world or save their fellow people or save the environment or whatever, right? So it's because of the larger cause that they're thinking about that they engage in self-sacrificing heroic behavior, and we have no evidence that they want to be a hero. Now suppose we present all of this evidence to the proponent of the generalization in question. We say, look, we've tested these people, we've given them brain scans, we've done surveys with them, we've done all sorts of behavioral tests with them, and we can't find any evidence that they have some desire to be a hero, a desire that motivates their self-sacrificing heroic behavior. And suppose when we put this to the proponent of the generalization, they reply by saying, oh look, even if their desire to be a hero isn't rendered apparent by the tests that you've performed, it must still be there. After all, how else could we explain their self-sacrificing heroic behavior? Okay, but now it's clear that the person is offering us a self-sealer. It's a position which they can defend no matter what evidence they're presented with. Right? So no matter what evidence comes up, no matter what considerations come up, they can stick to their guns. They can continue to propound their view that all human action is selfish. But now it's pretty clear that the view that they're propounding, the proposition that they're putting forth, doesn't claim anything. It doesn't rule out any possible way that the world could be, because as we come upon various ways that the world is that seem to tell against their generalization, what they do is they make their generalization less and less specific so that even if the selfishness of which they speak isn't made manifest in any way at all, it's going to be made manifest in the human action itself. Right? So as long as there's human action, there's got to be selfishness, they say, because what other way could you explain the human action? Okay, that's a self-sealer. It's a self-sealer because they're simply insisting on the position in the face of any evidence that comes up. All right. Now, that's a self-sealing proposition. What's a self-sealing argument? Well, typically self-sealing arguments are arguments that contain, among their premises, self-sealing propositions. They're arguments that depend on self-sealing propositions. But there might be an example of a self-sealing argument that isn't like that. I say might. I don't say there is an example. I say there might be an example. Let me offer it to you now and see what you all think. Here's the example. Premise 1. Not every argument has a conclusion. See? Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, wait a second, didn't we define argument way back in one of those early weeks with a different teacher? Didn't we define argument as something that had one or more premises and a conclusion? Wasn't that just built into the very definition of argument? Well, look, sometimes things can be built into the very definition of something, but still you can come upon considerations or evidence that lead you to revise that definition. Right? There are all sorts of institutions in human life that are defined in various ways, and then as the world changes, we decide we want to revise that definition. And there could be good reasons for doing so. So, originally we defined an argument as some premises and a conclusion, but maybe we should revise that definition. Why does an argument need to have a conclusion? Couldn't an argument just have a premise and that's it? Well, I'll let you debate that in the forums. But I just wanted to point out that if this really is an argument, if this premise really does constitute an argument, then the premise is true that not every argument has a conclusion. But unless you can think of some way of refuting the proposition that not every argument has a conclusion, then this particular argument, consisting of the premise that not every argument has a conclusion, this particular argument is a self-sealer, because there's no evidence that you could present to show that the argument itself is unsound or unsuccessful. So, that's an example of an argument that's a self-sealer, which, if it is an argument that's a self-sealer, is not the same as any particular proposition that's a self-sealer. Because the premise, not every argument has a conclusion, that premise is a proposition, and that proposition is not a self-sealer. But if that premise is an argument, the argument may be a self-sealer. Okay? All right. So that concludes our week on fallacies of relevance and vacuity. I'll see you next week when we'll talk about refutation. See you then. Over the last couple of weeks, we've been talking about fallacies in order to help you all figure out ways in which you can criticize an argument. Right? Sometimes an argument might seem valid or strong, but if you recognize that it's actually a fallacy, that'll help you to see what's wrong with the argument and not to be moved by it. But there are other ways of criticizing arguments besides recognizing them as fallacies, or in any case, recognizing them as one of the kinds of fallacies that we've been discussing so far over the past couple of weeks. And this week, we're going to broaden our scope a little bit and talk about other ways of criticizing arguments. This week, we're going to talk about refutation, its varieties and pitfalls. So, what's refutation? What are the varieties of refutation? And what are the pitfalls of refutation? Let's address those questions in order. So first, what is refutation? Refutation, or to refute an argument, is to show that the argument is unsuccessful in some way or other. That's what you're doing when you refute an argument. You're showing that the argument is unsuccessful in some way or other. Now, an argument might be unsuccessful because we're not entitled to accept its premises. Right? Maybe its premises are false. Or maybe, whether they're true or false, we just have no reason to accept them. Or an argument may be unsuccessful because whether or not its premises are true or known by us to be true, the premises don't support the conclusion of the argument. Right? So the conclusion isn't adequately supported by the premises. It doesn't follow from the premises. It's not something that the premises give us very powerful reason to believe. So we can refute an argument by showing that it's unsuccessful in any of those ways. Okay, so because refuting an argument is just to show that it's unsuccessful in any of those ways, there are going to be different ways to refute an argument corresponding to the different ways in which arguments can be unsuccessful. So for instance, if we're going to show that the premises of an argument don't support its conclusion, then we can do that by means of something that we'll call refutation by parallel reasoning. Right? One way of doing that, of course, is to point out that the argument is a fallacy. right? It might appear valid or strong, but in fact it's not. But another way of doing that, independently of pointing out that it's a fallacy, is to refute the argument by parallel reasoning. And in the next lecture, we'll talk about what refutation by parallel reasoning is. Another way that we might refute an argument is by showing that its premises are false, or in any case, whether they're false or not, we're not entitled to accept them. And we can do that, we can show that we're not entitled to accept the premises by using things that we'll call counterexamples, or a method that we'll call reductio ad absurdum. Okay? So those are the varieties of refutation. We can refute an argument by means of parallel reasoning, we can refute an argument by means of counterexamples, or we can refute an argument by reductio ad absurdum. And we'll talk about those different varieties of refutation this week. Now, often refutations are successful and help us to see why an argument that someone else is giving, or maybe an argument that we ourselves gave, is unsuccessful. But sometimes refutations don't work. In particular, there are a couple of different kinds of error to which refutations are especially liable. One of those kinds of error is what's called attacking a straw man or refuting a straw man. Sometimes when you try to refute a particular argument, you end up attacking something that isn't quite the same as that argument. Something that might seem very similar to that argument, you might mistake it for being the same as that argument, but it's not quite the same, and the difference is significant. That's called attacking a straw man. Your refutation of an argument also might be unsuccessful because it depends upon a false dichotomy. You assume that a particular dichotomy is true. Either things have to be one way or they have to be another way. And you make that assumption in attempting to refute an argument, but your refutation is unsuccessful because the assumption that you've made, the assumption that things have to be either one way or another way, is a false assumption. That's called a false dichotomy. Okay, so those are some dangers to which refutation is subject, and we'll also be talking about those this week. All right. So now that we've said what refutation is, what its varieties are, and what its dangers are, let's start talking about particular kinds of refutation. Next time, we're going to talk about refutation by parallel reasoning. See you next time. Today we're going to talk about refutation by parallel reasoning. Okay, so what's refutation by parallel reasoning? Let me start by giving a definition, and then I'll give some examples. So first, to refute an argument by parallel reasoning is to show that the argument's form is not valid or strong. The form of the argument is bad. Now, one way to show that, a way that we've described over the past couple of weeks, is to show that the argument commits one of the fallacies that we've described. For instance, that it commits some kind of a slippery slope fallacy, or it's a fallacious dismisser, a fallacious amplifier, or commits a fallacy of equivocation. That's one way to show that an argument is a fallacy, that its form is not valid or strong, that its premises, whether true or not, don't support its conclusion. But sometimes an argument is a fallacy even though it doesn't fit into any of the categories of fallacy that we've described up until now. But you can still show it's a fallacy, and the way you show it's a fallacy then is to refute it by parallel reasoning. And the way you do that is by finding another argument that has exactly the same form as the first argument. Exactly the same form, but the other argument is clearly a fallacy. So if the second argument is clearly a fallacy, and it has the same form as the first argument, then the first argument must also be clearly a fallacy. Since whether an argument is a fallacy or not doesn't depend on the truth of its premises or the truth of its conclusion, whether an argument is a fallacy or not just depends on its form, on the relationship between the premises and the conclusion. So if you can find an argument with exactly the same form that's clearly a fallacy, that shows that the first argument is a fallacy. That's refutation by parallel reasoning. Now let me give you some examples. So consider this argument. Premise: if I had a higher salary, I could buy a bigger house. Conclusion: therefore, if everyone had a higher salary, everyone could buy a bigger house. Okay, now I've heard reasoning that resembles this kind of reasoning in the past. People think, well, if we can raise one person's wages and make them materially better off, then if we could raise everyone's wages, we could make everyone materially better off. Okay, but tempting as this kind of reasoning may be, it's fallacious. And in order to show that it's fallacious, let me refute it by parallel reasoning. Let me find another argument that has exactly the same form, but that's obviously a fallacy. So consider this example. This is a parallel argument. If one person stands up at a ball game, then she'll get a better view. Right? Imagine that she's sitting in an audience of people, all of whom are seated. Right? So there are all these people seated and watching the ball game, and maybe the people sitting in front of her are blocking her view of the events in the stadium. So she decides to stand up so she can see over the heads of the people seated in front of her. So if she stands up, she'll get a better view. Conclusion: if everyone stands up at a ball game, then everyone will get a better view. Okay, well, that conclusion is not just obviously false, but it's clearly not supported by the true premise. In fact, this argument is a very clear example of an invalid argument because the premise is very plausibly true. Just about any ball game, when you have one person sitting down, if they stand up, they individually are going to get a better view. But the conclusion is certainly false. If everyone stands up, then that does not mean that everyone will get a better view. In fact, if everyone stands up, then there are going to be some people who end up getting a worse view. So, this is clearly an invalid argument. But if this argument is invalid, then this argument must also be invalid because they have the same form. And that shows that this first argument about salaries has got to be invalid. It's got to be invalid because it has exactly the same form as the second argument about standing up at a ball game. It has exactly the same form, and the second argument is obviously a fallacy because in most scenarios the premise would be true and the conclusion would be false. So if the second argument is invalid, the first argument must be as well. Okay, that's an example of refutation by parallel reasoning. Now let's consider another example so you get the idea. So consider this argument. Premise one: most people who start their own businesses, ignore statistics of failure, right? Because the statistics of failure for startup businesses are pretty bleak. Vast majority of startup businesses fail. They lose money, they go out of business. They go into bankruptcy. So most people who start businesses have to ignore all that, have to believe somehow, despite all the statistics of failure, that they are going to succeed. Premise two: most people who ignore statistics of failure are stupid. Conclusion: therefore, most people who start businesses are stupid. Okay. Now, let me say immediately that I think this argument is a fallacy, and furthermore, that its conclusion is false. But how can we see that this argument is a fallacy? For most people who start businesses ignore statistics of failure, and most people who ignore statistics of failure are stupid, how can we see that it's fallacious to infer most people who start businesses are stupid? Well, to see how this argument is a fallacy, compare it to this other argument that has exactly the same form of reasoning. Okay, so here's a parallel argument. Most of my friends are organisms. Right? I mean, it's possible that a few of my friends are robots, but I think that's unlikely. I think at the very least, most of my friends are organisms. If one or two of them are automata who are cleverly disguised to look and act like human beings, so be it. Still, most of my friends, I'm confident, are organisms. Now, most organisms are microscopic. Of course, we don't always keep that in mind because most of the organisms that we interact with on a day-to-day basis are not microscopic. Human beings, dogs, cats, trees, right? These organisms are not microscopic, but in fact, most of the organisms that exist are microscopic. So, someone might infer, well, if most of my friends are organisms and most organisms are microscopic, then doesn't it follow that most of my friends are microscopic? Well, no, obviously not. In fact, none of my friends are microscopic. All of my friends are creatures that I can see without the use of a microscope. So this argument right here is obviously a fallacy. I mean, both of the premises are true, and the conclusion is certainly false. So this argument is obviously a fallacy. It's an invalid argument. But since this argument is invalid, and it has exactly the same form as this earlier argument about ignoring statistics of failure, it follows that this earlier argument must be invalid. Right? This earlier argument from the premises, most people who start businesses ignore statistics of failure, and most people who ignore statistics of failure are stupid, it does not follow that most people who start businesses are stupid. That doesn't follow at all. This is a fallacy. It's an invalid argument. Just showed that by means of parallel reasoning, by finding a parallel argument that has exactly the same form, but it's clearly a fallacy. So since this parallel argument is clearly a fallacy, this earlier argument about ignoring statistics of failure must also be a fallacy. Okay. Now, refutation by parallel reasoning doesn't always work. Sometimes we get results that are unclear or don't show what we were trying to show. For instance, let me give you an example of that. So consider the following argument. If guns are outlawed, only outlaws will have guns. That's premise one. Premise two, it would be bad if only outlaws had guns. Conclusion, therefore guns should not be outlawed. Okay, so that's an argument. It'll be familiar to some Americans. That's an argument. Is it a fallacy or not? Well, suppose we try to refute it by parallel reasoning as follows. If gum is outlawed, only outlaws will have gum. It would be bad if only outlaws had gum. Therefore, gum should not be outlawed. Now notice, this parallel argument has exactly the same form as this earlier argument about guns. The two arguments have the same form. So if one of them is a fallacy, then the other one is a fallacy. But is this argument a fallacy? That's not clear. It's not at all clear that it's a fallacy. So this attempt to refute our earlier argument by parallel reasoning doesn't succeed. It doesn't succeed because the parallel argument is not clearly a fallacy. So we can't tell by looking at the parallel argument whether the earlier argument about guns was a fallacy. So this is a case of refutation by parallel reasoning that doesn't succeed. So what's crucial in refutation by parallel reasoning is this. First of all, you have to make sure that the parallel argument that you're using to refute the original argument, that the parallel argument has exactly the same form as the original argument. And in all three of our examples that we've looked at, that is true. The parallel argument does have the same form as the original argument. But the second thing you need to make sure of is that the parallel argument is clearly a fallacy. Right? If you're trying to show that the original argument is a fallacy, and you're trying to show it by means of parallel reasoning, then the parallel argument that you pick has to clearly be a fallacy. Because otherwise, you haven't shown that the original argument is a fallacy. Okay? And this third example doesn't meet that second criterion. The parallel argument is not clearly a fallacy. Okay. So, that's refutation by parallel reasoning. Next time, we'll consider another way of refuting an argument. See you next time. Today we're going to talk about false dichotomies. A false dichotomy is something that can go wrong with an argument, but it can go wrong either with an argument that we're trying to refute, and so we can refute that argument by showing that it depends on a false dichotomy, but it can also go wrong with the argument that we're giving by way of refutation. In other words, our attempted refutation of an argument can go wrong because it relies on a false dichotomy. So, what's a false dichotomy and why is it a bad thing? Let's talk about that now. A false dichotomy is when an argument relies upon a false dichotomy, when that argument falsely assumes that there are only two possibilities, when in fact there are more than two possibilities. Okay, this is a common problem with arguments. It's a common problem with arguments that we try to refute, and it's also a common problem with arguments that try to refute them. Let's look at some examples. So consider the following argument. You can imagine someone from, let's say, a powerful Western nation giving the following argument in the course of determining which alliances to foster and which international relations to cut off. Either other nations are with us or they're against us in our war against terrorism. That's premise one. Premise two, Switzerland is not with us. Conclusion, Switzerland is against us. And then from this conclusion, you can imagine that the proponent of this argument would draw various further conclusions, like that diplomatic relations with Switzerland should be cut off, that trade relations with Switzerland should be cut off, and so forth. Maybe we should have an embargo on Swiss goods. So the problem with this argument is that even if premise 2 of the argument is true, and actually even if premise 3 of the argument is true, premise 1 of the argument is a false dichotomy, or at least may very well be a false dichotomy. Isn't it possible that a nation might simply be neutral with respect to a particular conflict that our nation has with some other force? Right? Couldn't a nation simply be neutral with respect to that conflict? Why must they choose between being with us and being against us? Why couldn't they just remain neutral? Right? So this argument relies on a false dichotomy, and we can refute the argument by showing that it relies on a false dichotomy. Here's another example of an argument that relies on a false dichotomy. So imagine someone argues as follows. Look, premise 1, either the government must listen into our phone calls, or else they will be collecting our body parts after another terrorist attack. Premise 2, better to listen into our phone calls than to collect our body parts, right? We'd rather lose our privacy than lose our lives. Conclusion, the government must listen into our phone calls. Now again, let's suppose that premise 2 is true. In fact, we can even suppose that the conclusion is true. But even if the conclusion is true, this argument does not successfully show that the conclusion is true. And the reason it doesn't successfully show that the conclusion is true is that premise 1, again, is a false dichotomy. Premise 1 assumes that there are only two possible situations. Either the government is listening in to all our phone calls, or there's going to be another terrorist attack, and the government will have to collect our body parts. But why are those two the only possible situations? Is there absolutely no other way of preventing another terrorist attack, or in any case, reducing the likelihood of another terrorist attack, without listening into our phone calls? Until someone can establish that there is no other possible way of doing that, we can suspect that premise 1 of this argument is a false dichotomy. And so the argument is unsuccessful. The argument doesn't show that its conclusion is true, even if its conclusion is true. So those are two examples of arguments that rely on a false dichotomy. Now, I'd like you to look at the following video clip, in which you'll hear 3 arguments given. Now, the first of the 3 arguments is an appeal to popular opinion, but then I think you'll see some examples of false dichotomy. Okay, we'll talk about it right after the video clip is over.
You know that we don't catch that fishing boat, there ain't gonna be no deep sea fishing. We'll have to stay on the dock with the old people here. Hold it. What are you doing here? What? What about the other foot? There ain't no sock on it. I'll get to it. Don't you know that the whole world puts on a sock and a sock and a shoe and a shoe? I like to take care of 1 foot at a time.
That's the dumbest thing I ever heard in my life.
It's just as quick my way.
Wait a minute, that ain't the prank. You see what I don't keep doing it. Listen to me. Suppose there's a fire in the house and you got to run for your life. Your way, all you got on is 1 shoe and a sock. My way, you got on a sock and a sock. You see, you're even.
Suppose it's raining or snowing outside. Your way, with a sock on each foot, my feet would get wet. My way, with a sock and a shoe on 1 foot, I could hop around and stay dry.
I think you've been hopping around on your head. Wait a minute, listen to me. Supposing the other sock's got a hole in it.
It doesn't have a hole in it.
I said supposing
All
it's
right,
got a hole.
suppose it has a hole.
All right, it's got a hole in it. So, you ain't got another matching pair, so what do you gotta do? Your way, you gotta take off a whole shoe and a sock. My way, all you gotta do is take off 1 sock.
All right, if it'll make you happy, I'll start all over again.
No, you're halfway through. Now, gee, get on with it. We're in a hurry. You can start doing it the right way tomorrow morning. And do it that way for the rest of your life.
Older Americans are going to recognize that video clip as from a TV show called All in the Family, which aired in the 1970s in the United States. The older character with white hair is named Archie, and the younger character with brown hair and a mustache is named Michael. Now in that clip, Archie gives Michael 3 arguments for the conclusion that Michael ought to put on a sock and a shoe and a shoe. In contrast to the way Michael's actually doing it, which is to put on a sock and a shoe and a sock and a shoe. Now, the first of those 3 arguments is just an appeal to popular opinion and goes like this. Premise: the whole world puts on a sock and a sock and a shoe and a shoe. Conclusion: Archie doesn't spell out this conclusion, but clearly it's the conclusion that he wants Michael to draw. You, Michael, ought to put on a sock and a sock and a shoe and a shoe, since after all, that's how the whole world does it. Now, that's an appeal to popular opinion, and clearly it's fallacious. Just because the whole world does it doesn't provide a reason for you to do it. Of course, if there's a good reason why the whole world does it that way, then whatever that good reason is, that might also be a good reason for you to do it that way. But the fact that the whole world does it that way by itself, that's not a good reason for you to do it that way. It might be evidence that there is a good reason, but by itself it's not a good reason. And so Michael says, I like to take care of 1 foot at a time. Perfectly good rebuttal to that argument. Okay, now that's an appeal to popular opinion. It's a fallacy of relevance, and those we discussed last week. But the next 2 arguments are interesting examples of false dichotomy arguments. Let's consider each one of them. So in the next argument, Archie says the following. Premise 1. If you have to rush out of the house halfway through putting on your footwear, well, either your feet will each have a sock on them, or 1 foot will have a sock and a shoe on it, and the other foot will have nothing on it. Okay. Premise 2. Better for your feet to be even than to not be even. Let's suppose that's true. And so, conclusion, better to put on both your socks first. Okay. Now, this argument is a fallacy. And it's a fallacy even if premise 2 is true. I don't know if premise 2 is true, but even if premise 2 is true, and even if the conclusion is true, the argument is still a fallacy. And it's a fallacy because premise 1 and premise 2 together don't support the conclusion. See, premise 1 says if you're under certain circumstances, namely you have to rush out of the house halfway through putting on your footwear, then either your feet will each have a sock or 1 foot will have a sock and a shoe and the other will have nothing. Okay, that's right, and maybe it is true that it's better for your feet to be even than not. That doesn't mean that it's better, all things considered, to put on both your socks first. Because what if you don't have to rush out of the house halfway through putting on your footwear? I mean, Archie considers the case in which you do have to rush out of the house halfway through putting on your footwear, but first of all, that situation is one that's extremely unlikely to be the case, and secondly, he pays no attention to what would happen, what the consequences would be of the different courses of action when that situation isn't the case. In other words, when you don't have to rush out of the house halfway through putting on your footwear. So this is a false dichotomy, not because premise one is false, but because in the transition from the two premises to the conclusion, what Archie loses track of is that premise one is true only given the condition that you have to rush out of the house halfway through putting on your footwear. Right? So if you're in that situation, if you have to rush out of the house halfway through putting on your footwear, then the following two are the only possibilities. You have a sock and a sock, or you just have a sock and a shoe. Those are the only two possibilities if you have to rush out of the house halfway through putting on your footwear. But if we don't restrict ourselves to considering the situation in which you have to rush out of the house halfway through putting on your footwear, then we see that there are lots more possibilities. You could have to rush out of the house a quarter of the way through putting on your footwear, or 3/4 of the way through putting on your footwear, or immediately after putting on your footwear, or maybe you don't have to rush out of the house at all. So there are all sorts of other possibilities in which the dichotomy that Archie lists in premise one, the dichotomy either you have a sock and a sock or you have a sock and a shoe, in which that dichotomy just doesn't hold, in which there's a third possibility on top of the two possibilities that Archie mentions. And Michael, interestingly, tries to show that Archie's argument is no good by giving his own argument of exactly the same form with an incompatible conclusion, that it's better to put on a sock and a shoe first. Remember, on Michael's alternative argument, he says, well, suppose you have to rush out of the house halfway through putting on your footwear, but it's raining outside. Right? If you have a sock and sock, then both your feet will get wet, whereas if you have a sock and a shoe, then you can hop around on one foot and stay dry. So that's an argument of the same form as Archie's argument, but it reaches an incompatible conclusion, the conclusion namely that it's better to put on a sock and a shoe and a sock and a shoe rather than a sock and a sock and a shoe and a shoe. And that just shows that Archie's argument wasn't itself very compelling. Okay, so that's Archie's second argument, and that's guilty of a false dichotomy. Now let's consider Archie's third argument, which goes like this. Premise one, if you find a hole in your second sock after putting on two socks, then you need only change your socks. Premise two, if you find a hole in your second sock after putting on a sock and a shoe, then you need to take off your shoe. Premise three, it's easier to take off two socks than a sock and a shoe, so conclusion, better to put on your socks first. Okay, now Michael doesn't actually try to rebut this argument, but it's worth our while considering how compelling this argument is. See, this argument, like the one before it, also seems to rely on a false dichotomy. The false dichotomy is this. Under a certain circumstance, namely when you find a hole in your second sock, one of two possible situations obtains. Either you only need to change your socks, or you need to take off your shoe in addition to changing your socks. So under that scenario, when you find a hole in your second sock, then there are only two possible outcomes. You have to change your socks, or you have to take off your shoe in addition to changing your socks. Okay, now that might be right. Well, actually it's not right, because you do have the alternative of simply walking around with a hole in your second sock, or of just having unmatched socks. But let's suppose we rule that out somehow. We rule out the acceptability of walking around with unmatched socks or with a hole in your second sock. So we allow that under the circumstances that Archie envisages, namely where you find a hole in your second sock, only one of two possible scenarios can obtain. Either you have to change your two socks, or you have to take off your shoe in addition to changing your socks. Okay, so there's a dichotomy, but it's a dichotomy that obtains only when we're in the situation that Archie specified, namely where we find a hole in our second sock. But what if we don't find a hole in our second sock? Then there are any number of situations that could obtain, right? We could end up putting on our socks and shoes and not having to change anything. Or we could end up changing one sock after finding a hole in our first sock. We could end up having to take off our shoe after we find not that there's a hole in our second sock, but that the first shoe doesn't feel comfortable with the first sock. There are any number of scenarios that could obtain, but Archie restricts himself to considering just two possible scenarios, the one where you have to change your two socks versus the one where you have to change your two socks and take off your shoe, and he restricts himself to considering just those two possible scenarios because he's only thinking about a situation in which what prompts you to change your footwear is finding a hole in your second sock. He's not considering any other possible situation. And so, once again, in this instance, he's guilty of a false dichotomy. He's arguing that it's better to put on your socks first, but he's arguing that by showing that given a certain pair of options, that's the pair of options that you're facing when you find a hole in your second sock, given just that pair of options, it's better to put on your socks first. But why are those two the only possible options? Archie doesn't tell us that. That's what makes his argument a bad argument. Okay, so I hope I've given some real-life examples here of false dichotomies that can occur in arguments and that can vitiate those arguments, that can make them bad arguments. Okay, now in the exercises we'll consider more examples of that. Today we're going to talk about a kind of refutation that we call a reductio ad absurdum. Now, what's a reductio ad absurdum, and why does it have such a mysterious name? Let's begin with the definition. So, reductio ad absurdum is a Latin phrase that means reduce to absurdity. And that's what a reductio ad absurdum is. It's a refutation of an argument that focuses on a particular claim in that argument, either one of the premises or the conclusion. And it shows that that claim, that proposition, implies some absurdity. And since it implies some absurdity, the claim itself has to be false, because nothing that's true can imply something that's obviously false. Only something that's false can imply something that's obviously false. And so, if you do a reductio ad absurdum on a proposition, you show that the proposition is false, and if that proposition is one of the premises or the conclusion of an argument, then you've refuted that argument. You've shown that that argument is unsuccessful. Okay, so that's a reductio ad absurdum. Let's look at some examples. So consider this argument. Premise 1, the best way to fight theft is to eliminate the conditions that make it possible. Premise 2, the use of a tangible medium of exchange, like cash, let's say, or gold, is a condition that makes theft possible, right? Without a tangible medium of exchange, there can't be any theft. Conclusion, therefore, the best way to fight theft is to eliminate tangible media of exchange. Now, I've actually heard this argument before. The argument is that if all exchanges, all transactions take place electronically, let's say in a way that's traceable by your fingerprint or by your retinal scan or something like that, if there's no cash, if there's no tangible medium of exchange, then we eliminate the black market and all kinds of goods and services, and we also eliminate the violent crime that's associated with stealing cash. Okay, so the conclusion of this argument might be true. In any case, it might be true for all I'm going to say here. But what I want to point out right now is that we can use reductio ad absurdum to show that premise 1 of this argument is false. So whatever else is true about the conclusion of the argument, premise 1 of the argument is false. And so the argument itself does not succeed in proving its conclusion. So why do I say premise 1 of the argument is false, that the best way to fight theft is to eliminate the conditions that make it possible? Well, if that were true, then think about the various conditions that make theft possible. One of the conditions that makes theft possible is oxygen, or water, or any of the conditions that make human life on the earth possible. Right? Without those conditions, of course, theft wouldn't be possible. So that would imply, premise 1 would imply, that the best way to fight theft is to eliminate the conditions like oxygen, like water, that make theft possible. But that's clearly not the best way to fight theft. It would, of course, be a way to fight theft, but it's not the best way. So premise one implies something that's obviously false, namely that the best way to fight theft would be to eliminate oxygen and to eliminate water. That's obviously false. And so premise one itself must be false, because nothing that's true could imply something that's obviously false. Okay, so that's an example of how we can refute this argument using reductio ad absurdum to show that premise one of the argument is false. Here's another example. So consider this argument. Premise: if you count long enough, you will eventually run out of numbers to count. Conclusion: therefore, counting is an activity that cannot go on forever. Now, this argument is valid, but the premise of the argument isn't true, and so the argument isn't sound. Why is the premise of the argument not true? Why is it not true that if you count long enough, you'll eventually run out of numbers to count? Well, here's a way to see that it's not true. Suppose for a moment that it were true, that if you count long enough, you'll eventually run out of numbers to count. Suppose that were true. Well, then there would be some last number, some greatest number. Now, whatever that number is, call it n. But now, whatever that number is, we can just add 1 to it. Right? Addition is going to be defined over that number n, whatever n is, and 1. So we can add 1 to n, and now we come up with a greater number. So if this premise were true, then it would imply something that's inconsistent with the premise, namely that there's a larger number than n. So the premise can't be true, because it implies something that's inconsistent with the premise itself. So the premise is false, and that shows that the argument is unsuccessful. So we just did a reductio ad absurdum of the premise of our argument. Now, I just gave a couple of examples of reductio ad absurdums that work. But not every attempt at a reductio ad absurdum works. Consider this one. Premise: some things exist even though no one is thinking of them. Conclusion: therefore, reality exceeds the reach of the mind. There's more to reality than there is in the mind. Now, suppose someone challenges the premise of this argument as follows. They say, look, you're saying that some things exist even though no one is thinking of them. But as you're saying that, presumably you're not just mouthing the words, you're really thinking it. You're thinking that some things exist even though no one is thinking of them. But if you're thinking that proposition, then you are thinking of those things. So whatever those things are that allegedly exist, even when no one is thinking of them, well, you're thinking of them right now. And so the proposition that you're thinking, namely that some things exist even though no one is thinking of them, that proposition is not true because you're thinking of those very things right now. Those very things that exist even though allegedly no one is thinking of them. Okay, now I leave it as an exercise for you to work out and for you all to discuss with each other in the forums. What's wrong with this attempt at a reductio ad absurdum of the premise of this argument? I'll let you think about that. See you next time. Today we're going to talk about how to refute an argument by using counterexamples. So what's a counterexample and how does it help to refute an argument? A counterexample is an example that runs counter to some generalization and thereby shows that the generalization is false. Now, counterexamples can be used to refute an argument that contains a generalization either as one of its premises or as its conclusion. So if the argument contains a generalization as its conclusion, and the counterexample shows that the generalization is false, then in effect what the counterexample does is show that the argument reaches a false conclusion. If the argument contains a generalization as one of its premises, then the counterexample shows that that premise of the argument is false. But either way, the counterexample shows that the argument is unsuccessful, either because the argument has a false premise or because its conclusion is false. Okay, so what are some examples of counterexamples? Well, let's start by considering this argument. Premise 1. You should always treat others the same way that you would like to be treated yourself. Premise 2. I would not like anyone to change my diapers. So, conclusion, I should not change the baby's diapers. Now, this argument appears to be valid. Furthermore, I can assure you, premise 2 is true. So, if premise 1 is also true, then it looks like I have a good argument for why I shouldn't change the baby's diapers. I should get someone else to do it. But is premise 1 true? Well, premise 1 sounds familiar enough. You should always treat others the same way that you would like to be treated yourself. That's something we frequently hear people say. But that can't be precisely true. After all, I would like to be treated as an adult. But that doesn't mean that I should treat my children as adults, right? So if the generalization is that you should always treat others the same way that you would like to be treated yourself, that generalization is false. It's false because even though I would like to be treated as an adult, it doesn't mean that I should treat my children as adults. I shouldn't treat my children as adults because they're not adults, but I am. Now, that doesn't mean that I should baby my children, but I shouldn't treat them the same way that I would like to be treated myself. I shouldn't treat them as if they're adults. Okay, so that's a counterexample to premise 1. And that counterexample shows that premise 1, stated in the way that it's stated here, you should always treat others the same way that you would like to be treated yourself. Premise 1 stated in that way is false, and so this argument does not work. This argument does not succeed in showing that I should not change the baby's diapers. The reason it doesn't succeed is because one of its premises is false. Now, premise 1 might seem to be true, but if it seems to be true, that's only because something very similar to premise 1 is true. What's similar to premise 1 that is true is the claim that you should usually, typically, often treat others the same way that you would like to be treated yourself. Now, those claims are true. You should usually treat others the same way that you'd like to be treated yourself. But that doesn't mean you should always treat others the way that you'd like to be treated yourself. That general claim about how you should always behave, that claim is false, and our counterexample shows it. So there's an example of the use of counterexample to refute an argument. Let's consider another example. So consider this argument. Premise 1, if it's wrong for all of us to perform a particular action, then it's wrong for any of us to perform that action. Premise 2, it's wrong for all of us to try to take the last piece of bread on the table. So, conclusion, it's wrong for any of us to try to take the last piece of bread on the table. You could imagine this situation. Let's say a bunch of us are sitting around the dinner table eating dinner, and there's a basket of bread in the middle of the table, and we've been, bit by bit, reaching in to take out pieces of bread and eat them. And now there's only one piece of bread left in the basket, and there are a bunch of us sitting around the table. Well, it would be wrong for all of us to jump up and grab that piece of bread and start fighting over it. That would be wrong. That would be completely unacceptable. But just because that would be unacceptable, does that mean that none of us is allowed to go and eat that last piece of bread? Well, no, that seems like a preposterous conclusion. I mean, if all of us have to sit there just staring at that last piece of bread and none of us is allowed to eat it, well, then that's wasting food. That's not an acceptable conclusion. So it's got to be okay for one of us to take that last piece of bread, even though it's not okay for all of us to try to take that last piece of bread. So here's an example where it's okay for one person to do something, even though it's not okay for everyone simultaneously to do that thing. Right? It's okay for one, it's not okay for everyone. So that's a counterexample to the generalization that occurs in premise 1 of our argument. So this argument is not a successful argument. This argument does not prove that it's wrong for any of us to try to take the last piece of bread on the table. And the reason it doesn't prove that is not because the argument is a fallacy. The reason it doesn't prove that is because premise 1 of the argument is false. Premise 1 of the argument states a general claim, and that general claim that it states is not true. While it might be true that it's usually wrong for anyone to perform an action that it's wrong for everyone to perform, it's not true that it's always wrong for anyone to perform an action that it's wrong for everyone to perform. And in fact, I just gave a counterexample to that generalization. It's not wrong for one person to take a piece of bread, the last piece of bread on the table, even though it would be wrong for everyone to try to take that piece of bread simultaneously. Okay, so there's another example of an argument that we can refute by means of counterexample. We can use a counterexample to show that premise 1 of that argument is false, and so the argument is unsuccessful. Finally, let's consider this third case. Premise 1, breaking the law is almost always wrong. Premise 2, double parking is breaking the law. So conclusion, double parking is almost always wrong. Now, can we refute this argument by means of counterexample? Well, there's no counterexample to premise 2. Premise 2 is simply true. Double parking is breaking the law. That's part of what's involved in double parking. When you double park, you are breaking the law. Well, what about premise 1? Breaking the law is almost always wrong. Is there a counterexample to that? No, there's no counterexample to premise 1 as stated. If premise 1 were to say breaking the law is always wrong, then we could produce a counterexample to premise 1. Sometimes it's an emergency, you have no choice but to double park, you have to do something very quickly. It's not wrong to double park in that situation, especially not if you're doing it for just a few seconds. It's not wrong to double park, and yet you're breaking the law because there's a law against double parking. So if premise 1 were to say breaking the law is always wrong, then there would be a counterexample to premise 1. But premise 1 doesn't say that. Premise 1 says breaking the law is almost always wrong. Now, how do you produce a counterexample to a claim of the form almost always? Well, the answer is you don't. Because even if you produce an example of a case where breaking the law is not wrong, that still doesn't show that it's false, that breaking the law is almost always wrong. Maybe breaking the law is almost always wrong, but just not in the case that you produced. So you can't produce a counterexample to a generalization of the form breaking the law is almost always wrong. That generalization might be false, but you can't show that it's false by using a counterexample. Okay, so we cannot refute this argument by means of counterexample. That's not to say that this is a good argument. In fact, this third argument is not a good argument, but we can't show that it's not a good argument by using a counterexample. So sometimes counterexample can succeed in refuting an argument, and sometimes it can't. It depends on whether the argument contains a generalization to the effect that something always happens, or something is true in all cases. If the argument contains a generalization like that, an unexceptional generalization, a generalization without any room for exceptions, then a counterexample can be used to refute that generalization. But if a generalization is phrased in such a way that it admits of exceptions, like if a generalization talks about what almost always happens, or about what usually happens, about what typically happens, then we can't refute that generalization by means of counterexamples. Okay, so we can look at examples of counterexamples in the exercises that follow. See you next time. One problem that can arise when you try to refute an argument is that you end up attacking a straw man. Now, what does that mean? What is attacking a straw man? Let me start off by giving a definition and then giving some examples. So, to attack a straw man is to misunderstand the argument or the hypothesis that you're attempting to refute. You might try to refute an argument or show that a particular hypothesis is false, but if in the course of doing that you end up misunderstanding the argument or the hypothesis, then we say you're attacking a straw man. Here's some examples of that phenomenon. So imagine that Walter and I are having a conversation, and Walter claims the United States should not have sent in troops back in 2003 to depose the government of Saddam Hussein in Iraq. And I hear Walter say this, and I respond by saying, "Oh, so, Walter, you must think that the suffering that Saddam Hussein imposed upon his citizens just doesn't count for anything." Okay, now clearly, I'm trying to criticize what Walter is saying, but my criticism misunderstands what he's saying. Walter didn't say that the suffering that Saddam Hussein imposed upon his citizens doesn't count for anything. Walter just said the United States should not have sent in ground troops in 2003 to depose the government of Saddam Hussein. Now, why does Walter think that? There could be any number of reasons why Walter thinks that. But his having reasons for thinking that is consistent with Walter's also thinking that the suffering that Saddam Hussein imposed upon his own citizens matters a lot. But maybe there would have been more effective ways to address that suffering without sending in ground troops to depose his government. So, until I understand better how Walter is defending his view that the United States should not have sent in troops to depose the government of Saddam Hussein, I'm attacking a straw man when I say, "Oh, so you must think that the suffering that he imposed upon his citizens doesn't count for anything." So there's one example of attacking a straw man. Here's another example. Suppose, once again, Walter and I are having a conversation, and I say, we should distribute condoms to teenagers around the world in order to prevent unwanted pregnancies and all the tragic costs that result from unwanted pregnancies. And Walter says, "Oh, so you must want to encourage teenagers all over the world to have as much sex as possible." Now there, Walter's attacking a straw man. Right? Until he understands what my reasons are for thinking that we should distribute condoms to teenagers around the world, and until he can evaluate the benefits that I see to that policy against the possible costs of possibly making it easier for some teenagers to have sex, he can't simply assume that I want to encourage teenagers to have as much sex as possible. Maybe I don't want that. Maybe I don't want to encourage teenagers to have as much sex as possible, but I still think that it's a good idea to distribute condoms to teenagers around the world in order to prevent unwanted pregnancies. So here's an example where Walter is attacking a straw man. Okay, now in the video clip that follows, you're going to see David Mitchell, who's a British comedian, attacking another straw man. Let's take a listen.
Have you noticed it's no longer good enough to try and live in such a way that pleases you and doesn't outrage others? No, as if this was too easy a goal and we needed a refinement on the human condition to make a sufficient challenge of it, we are now supposed to live in the moment. It's not enough to work towards being happy later, you have to be happy now. Right now. No, now. Not then, not soon. Now. Well, that's unfair of me. I realise most of the living in the momenteers are not saying that's the only way of being happy that counts. Although, asterisk, some of them definitely are saying exactly that. They're recommending this as a way to become happy. Are they mad? Apart from the obvious paradox that any time I'm checking to see if I'm living in the moment or not, I cease to live in the moment, or rather the moment I'm living in becomes a moment of checking, the range of pleasures available to people living in the moment is both small and, well, bestial. Unless you're in the middle of something delicious, intoxicating, carnal, or whatever the posh word for sneezing is, you're stuck. And out of those, the only one that requires no un-in-the-moment planning or forethought whatsoever is sneezing. And nice though a good sneeze is, after 3 they get annoying. And what's more, I don't think it's as easy as all that to tell whether or not you're enjoying a moment in that moment. I remember watching the film Mulholland Drive and believing that I was enjoying myself as I anticipated the dramatic ending that would cleverly resolve and make sense of this intriguing mystery. But there wasn't one. It just sort of stopped. And once I realised that, I had no choice but to retrospectively downgrade what I had thought had been my enjoyment in the moment. My enjoyment was predicated on it amounting to something. It was an IOU to be redeemed at the point of pleasurable revelation, by which I don't mean the lesbian sex scene. And as there was none, the IOU was never redeemed. Therefore, I hadn't enjoyed myself. Where this is really starkly obvious, of course, is sport. Of the 3 big matches Andy Murray played this year, the one I enjoyed most at the time, by a country mile, was his last Olympic game, where he went into the lead early and stayed there until he won. The one I think I enjoyed most now is the US Open, where it was touch and go for hours, and then he won. Much more exciting, which is why I value it now, and hated it at the time. Because at the time, I had no way of knowing that the moment I was reluctantly suffering through wasn't a moment on a long and exhausting journey towards defeat, like the Wimbledon final, which neither in the moment me nor looking back me enjoyed at all. At the time, when watching any sporting contest in which I'm partisan, I don't have the faintest idea if I'm enjoying myself. My dominant emotion is, I really hope my team wins, so it will turn out later I'm enjoying myself now. That's the problem with living in the moment. We're too intelligent a species to be able to avoid living in some sort of narrative, and that involves not knowing how we feel in the moment until we have context for it. Too short-term a focus, and we've nothing to enjoy but sneezing. Too long-term a context, and it's all a plan to enjoy something we never get to, and anyway, we'll all be dead within 100 years. We have no choice but to find some sort of medium term over which to give a shit, or nothing is anything. And once you've granted that, then all the delayed gratifications are variations on a theme, and the theme is chores now for jam tomorrow. Whether it's I want to build a cathedral, or I fancy a sandwich, you're stuck in the middle with me.
Now, in the clip we just saw, David Mitchell gives 2 arguments against the advice to live in the moment. Now, what are those 2 arguments? Well, here's one of them. It goes like this. Premise 1. Living in the moment involves a very restricted set of pleasures. Mitchell describes them as bestial. Premise 2. A good life involves many pleasures outside that restricted range. And so, conclusion, a good life does not involve living in the moment. Okay. Now, I hope it'll be clear once we set the argument out like that this argument is not valid. This argument is not compelling at all. Just because living in the moment involves a very restricted set of pleasures, and let's suppose for the moment that it does, and a good life involves many pleasures outside that restricted range, and let's grant that it does, it doesn't follow that a good life does not involve living in the moment. For all that we get from premises 1 and 2, for all that those 2 premises tell us, it could be that a good life involves living in the moment and a whole lot of other things as well, and a whole lot of other pleasures as well, besides living in the moment. So this is an example of an argument that's not valid. But given how obvious the invalidity is, why does Mitchell think that this argument is worthwhile leveling against the proponent of living in the moment? he thinks it's worthwhile leveling against that proponent because he thinks that proponent is someone who says that a good life just involves the pleasures of living in the moment. But that's a misunderstanding of what the proponent of living in the moment is saying. The proponent of living in the moment isn't saying that life doesn't involve any pleasures whatsoever over and above living in the moment. The proponent of living in the moment is simply saying that in addition to whatever other pleasures life involves, we need to remember the pleasures of living in the moment. Okay, that's one argument that Mitchell uses against the proponent of living in the moment, and that argument is guilty of attacking a straw man. Here's the other argument that Mitchell uses against the proponent of living in the moment. It goes like this. Premise: living in the moment is ascertainable only after that moment. As Mitchell says, you can only check whether you're living in the moment if that moment that you're living in becomes one of checking. Conclusion: therefore living in the moment is impossible. Right? This is the paradox that Mitchell describes early in the clip. Now, how does it follow from the premise, living in the moment is ascertainable only after that moment, that living in the moment is impossible? How is this argument supposed to be a good one? Well, Mitchell's idea is if you're ascertaining whether you're living in the moment, then the moment that you're living in becomes one of checking. And since checking isn't itself pleasurable, you can't live in the moment. But that doesn't follow, because it leaves it open to the proponent of living in the moment to say that you can only live in the moment when you're not checking whether or not you're living in the moment. The happiness that you can enjoy when you're living in the moment is not a happiness that you can enjoy while you're checking to see that you're having that happiness. It's a happiness that you can enjoy only when you're not preoccupied with checking to see that you have it. So, once again, we have an invalid argument, and the invalid argument is badly directed against the proponent of living in the moment. Mitchell assumes that the proponent of living in the moment is affected by this argument because the proponent of living in the moment must think that living in the moment somehow requires knowing that you're living in that moment, and knowing that you're living in that moment somehow requires checking that you're living in that moment. But the proponent of living in the moment need require no such thing. The proponent of living in the moment might advise us to live in the moment without advising us to check whether we're living in that moment, without advising us to think about whether we're living in that moment, but simply to live in that moment. And Mitchell's argument doesn't affect the view that we should live in the moment, so long as that view isn't understood to be the view that we should check to see whether we're living in the moment. Okay, so those are two examples of straw man arguments that occur in the clip that we just saw. Both of them arguments directed against the proponent of living in the moment, but both of them attack a straw man. In the exercises that follow, we'll see some more examples of arguments that may or may not be attacking the straw man.
Okay. Finally, as the last argument in this course, is the one that bothers me most. And it comes from Lauren Brush. I think it must have bothered her too, because it's not clear that she was ever happy with the formulation and kept changing it. But I'm going to give a very simplified version of it and see if we can reconstruct it and determine whether it's really sound. This is what Lauren said, in my words, not hers exactly. Walter wants to up the number of students who get the most out of this class. Now that's true. I want to increase the number of students who get the most out of this class. That's the point of teaching. Therefore, Walter should shave his hair on camera and make the video open to all students. No, my beautiful locks, no. That is what's upsetting. But luckily, this argument's not valid. No way. It's possible for the premises to be true and the conclusion false. So, sorry, Lauren, I'm not convinced. Uh-oh. She can add another premise. She's probably assuming this More students will get the most out of this class if Walter shaves his hair on camera and makes the video open to all students. Okay, I guess I got to admit that too. I think people will get more out of the class if they see that, because part of what you get out of this class is you have some fun. At least I hope you've had fun. I have. Okay, Lauren, but still, it's not valid. It's not valid, and so I'm not going to shave my head yet. No way. Uh-oh. The main reason it wasn't valid was that the premises were about what I want, and the conclusion is about what I should do. But wait, now maybe it is valid. Sure looks valid if we add one more suppressed premise. Walter should do what will accomplish what he wants to do. Oh my gosh. But if what I want to accomplish is to get more students get the most out of the class, and if I should do what I want to do, then I should do what's going to make the most students get the most out of the class. And if shaving my head is doing that, then it sure looks like I should shave my head on camera and make it open to all the students. I feel like I'm in trouble now. What's going to happen? Oh, wait, I've got it. Even though it's valid, premise 3 is not true. That I should do what's going to accomplish what I want? What if I want something like, I want to smoke? Well, maybe I shouldn't go to the store and get a pack of cigarettes, because even though I want to smoke, I still shouldn't, because it's bad for me, because it's going to hurt me. So it looks like you have to qualify that premise by saying that I should do what will accomplish what I want to do, unless doing it has worse effects, like in smoking, when it might give me cancer and hurt me. So, now I'm safe. Now I don't have to shave my head. That makes me feel better. Because you can't get the conclusion that I should do it from those 3 premises, right? It's not valid anymore. Oh, he needs another premise. Walter shaving his head on camera and making the video open to all students will not have worse effects. Because shaving my head is not going to give me cancer like smoking. Matter of fact, hair will grow back. It might be embarrassing for a few days, but only a few days. That's not that bad compared to all those students out there in Coursera land. And so I guess I have to admit that premise 4 is true. But wait a minute. If the argument is valid, and premise 4 is true, and premise 3 is true, and premise 2 is true, premise 1 is true, now it's looking good. And we can even break it up to make it easier to understand. I want the number of students to increase that get the most out of the course. More will get most out of the course if I shave my head on camera and make that video available. So shaving my hair on camera, making the video available will give me what I want, and I ought to do what I want if it doesn't cause worse harm. This is not going to cause worse harm, so I ought to do it. Oh my gosh, now I'm worried, because that means that the conclusion's true. If the argument's sound, it's valid, and the premises are true, then the conclusion's sound. Or at least if I accept the premises and the conclusion follows validly, then I'm committed to that conclusion. I'm committed to the fact that I should shave my hair on camera and distribute the video to all students so you can all watch it. Lauren has convinced me of that. But notice, this argument applies to me, it also applies to Rom. So if I've got to shave my head, Rom's got to shave his beard. So, although I have to shave my head, at least I'm not alone. Guess we got to both go do it. I'm committed to the fact that I should shave my hair on camera and distribute the video to all students so you can all watch it. Lauren has convinced me of that. But notice, this argument applies to me, it also applies to Rom. So if I've got to shave my head, Rom's got to shave his beard. So, although I have to shave my head, at least I'm not alone. Guess we got to both go do it. Okay, so I'm convinced that I should shave my head, but I'm just not going to do it. I don't know if I could live without my beautiful locks.
Yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. I mean, I'm equally convinced that I should shave my beard, but it just doesn't feel right somehow.
I know. There's no way they're going to force us.
I don't think it's going to happen.
No.
It's just not going to happen.
Yo, I'm gonna make you do it. Dude, you need to recognize the power of reasoning and argument.
Oh no, he got me. Thanks to all of our students. We hope you learned a lot and had a lot of fun. We sure learned a lot from you. I remember learning about goats from a goat farmer in Afghanistan, and AIDS from an AIDS activist in Africa, and traffic flow from an Australian engineer, and wild dogs from a student from Eastern Europe. We've also been inspired by a lot of students. One student had her house destroyed by a cyclone and apologized for missing a deadline. An Iranian group of linguistics students met together every week, and so did a group in a cafe in San Francisco. We had visually challenged students from Eastern Europe, and one student with a chronic disease that had never been able to take a college course before. So now, sadly, we have to say goodbye, but we hope that the lessons will stay with you. Our goal has been to teach you to, first of all, ask whether you have good enough reasons for the positions that you hold, and then to enable you to formulate those reasons better when you do have good reasons for your own beliefs, but also to pay attention to other people and appreciate and be fair to opponents who hold different positions. So please use these skills throughout the rest of your life. They will help you cooperate with other people and succeed in your own goals, whatever you want to accomplish. So now there are only two things left to do. One, we'll send all that here to Lots of Love. And two, now that it's all gone, you might as well paint my entire head Duke blue. I don't know, I got my doubts now, but it did seem like a good idea at the time. Luckily, I'm not going to be alone. Rom, your turn.
So listen, you gotta make sure nobody knows about this, okay? I do not want to be associated with that big Duke Blue clown, okay? So nobody can know about this, all right? You don't tell anybody? All right. Good man. Okay. We are so grateful to all of you for taking the time out of your busy lives to take our course and help us make it even better for future generations of students. Thank you to the graphic designer from Mexico who secretly wants to go study philosophy. Thank you to the retired social worker from Darwin, Australia who is studying to become a workplace meditation consultant. Thank you to the recent college graduate from the Philippines who stuck with our course even when the massive typhoon tragically devastated her country. Thank you to the polite gentleman from Huntsville, Alabama who had to stand up to the criticism of his peers in order to take our course. Thank you to the young man from Rio de Janeiro who did the problem sets in the middle of Carnival. Thank you to the barber from Cairo who would complete the quizzes whenever he had a break between clients. Thank you to the taxi driver from Bangalore who would contribute to the discussion forums using voice recognition software while driving. Thank you to the hypnotist who found time to complete our course while also getting all of his clients to do so as well. And thank you to the anesthesiologist who would read our lecture transcripts out loud while at work. It is because of all of you that our work was worthwhile. Bye, guys. Thanks for doing such a great job. Bye.